Good afternoon. I want to thank all of the Global Markets Advisory Committee members for being here today. I know you all have a lot on your plates right now, so I just want to say how much we appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules to join us today to discuss a number of the important issues that we have before us at the CFTC. I also want to thank the CFTC staff that have worked hard to put together the presentations that we have on our agenda today. I'd like to welcome Patrick Pearson and Peter Kirstens from the European Commission. They were kind enough to join us last December at our GMAC meeting, and they're here again today to continue the discussion on coordinating our financial reform globally, and so I want to thank them also for being here. I also want to welcome two guests from the Japanese FSA. Mr. Sumi and Mr. Mori from the Japanese FSA are here to update us on legislation that passed in Japan earlier this year regarding OTC derivatives. I want to welcome also SEC Commissioner Kathy Casey, who is with us today and, as you all know, is very active in global coordination on financial regulatory issues. I'd like to start by asking if the GMAC committee members could go around the table and introduce themselves and their affiliation, and then I will turn to my colleagues on the dais. If we could start with Don.
Okay. I'm Don Wilson. I'm the founder and CEO of DRW Trading, which is a principal trading group. I am also one of the founding members of the ERIS Exchange, which is a futures exchange that has listed swap futures and clears them at the CME.
I'm Jeff Sprecher. I'm the CEO of Intercontinental Exchange.
Hi, Jiro Kochi, CEO of Reval. We provide derivative solutions to about 400 end users.
Bonnie Litt, I'm an attorney at Goldman Sachs.
Lori Ferber, General Counsel, MF Global.
Tom Callahan, I'm the CEO of NYSE Life US, which is the US derivatives business of NYSE Euronext.
Anthony Bell-Chambers, CEO of the European Futures and Options Association.
George Krappel, I'm co-CEO of Milburn Ridgefield, a CTA CPO.
Roger Liddell, CEO of LCH Clearnet.
John Nixon, Executive Director of ICAP.
Dan Roth, CEO of National Futures Association.
Connie Volstad, I'm the CEO of ISDA.
Richard Burliand, Head of Market Structure and Prime Services, JP Morgan.
Yukihiro Mori from Japan FSA.
Chikahisa Sumi from Japanese FSA. Thank you for your invitation.
Thank you so much for being here. I think we may have Mike Dolly, who is the chairman of the Futures Industry Association, on the phone. Mike, are you on the phone?
Yep, I'm on.
Great. Thank you for participating with us today. I'm going to go over a couple of housekeeping items, and then I'm going to turn to my colleagues for any opening statements. Just to let you know that the microphones push to talk, and if you could push after you're finished with your remarks. There can only be so many microphones on at the same time, so I ask you to turn those off after you finish speaking. If you would like to make a remark or have a question or a comment, if you can put your name tint up to be recognized. And finally, for the reporter doing the transcript today, if everyone could identify themselves before they speak, that's very helpful. I'd like to turn over to Chairman Gary Gensler for any opening statements.
Thank you, Commissioner Sommers, for chairing today's meeting. I just turned to Commissioner Sommers as you were introducing yourself and saying this is really an extraordinary group of people to be in one room at a time. Many of you come in and chat with us before the Dodd-Frank bill and now that it's passed, but I thank you each for your service because I know I benefit, I think our staffs benefit, I'm sure our commissioners benefit from each of your expertise. You know, we're hard at work at this, and I want to also thank my fellow commissioners for everything that they're doing, and Kathy, you're here too, so everything the SEC is doing because we have so many joint rules with the SEC. we're moving forward to harmonize our rules with the SEC, so it's terrific to have Kathy with us, though I don't know 6, it's going to, sometimes we need an odd number, though, to sort through things, but I also want to thank the members of the Japanese Financial Services Authority and European Commission. I've worked a little bit more closely with the European Commission recently, but I lived in Japan for 3 years, so maybe that will make for that I haven't been to visit yet in my stead here. Japan actually passed their derivatives reform bill first in, I think it was May. The European Commission just released their proposals, and I look forward to coordinating in consultation with each of their jurisdictions as we implement the reform. We benefit from a very strong working relationship across the oceans. Last week I traveled to Brussels to meet with members of the European Commission and speak at a conference at their request. And as we had in Dodd-Frank, the European proposal covers the entire derivatives marketplace, both bilaterals and cleared swaps. It's the whole product suite. The Japanese proposal as well includes a requirement that certain derivatives be centrally cleared, and that's where the European proposal is. I'm sure we'll hear more from Patrick and Peter on that, and it's where we are. So though we have different political systems and different cultures, we have a remarkable consensus here between the largest markets here. Clearinghouses have worked really since the late 19th century. They're not perfect, but they really do lower risk through clear skies and through difficult times like the 2008 crisis. The U.S., European, and Japanese proposals all recognize, though, the need for very robust risk management standards. We were chatting a little bit about this just socially at lunch, but I think that we certainly recognize this here, and I know we do around the globe. Also, the Dodd-Frank Act and the various proposals in Europe and in Japan recognize that the dealers themselves have to have the necessary capital to stand behind these trades, and whether it be through collateral requirements or margin requirements, that markets will have lower risk with that. And all 3 proposals also have requirements of transactions be reported to swap data repositories. As we write the rules regarding the clearing requirement, our staffs are going to look closely to the European and Japanese proposals to ensure consistency. We are also looking to the CPSS IOSCO standards, and certainly the work Kathy's doing, not just there, but on the FSB, which we'll hear about, because the consistency in bringing these rules together are so critical. At today's meeting, I at least look forward to hearing the views about the global financial regulatory system. Specifically, I'm looking forward to hearing not only how we move forward in the U.S., but how we move forward in the U.S. to be consistent with what people are doing overseas in the terms of the swap data repositories. What data do we need to require? We're actually kind of going to go before the Europeans. So in the next 8 to 10 weeks, we'll be putting out rules along with the SEC on swap data repositories. So I think it's incumbent upon us, where we can, to include data that the European and the Japanese markets also need. On clearinghouses as well, to meet rigorous risk management standards, though we hope to be able to comply with all the IOSCO principles. Are there specific principles from Europe or from Asia that you see that we need to do? Because at some moment in the future, maybe it's 2 or 3 years from now, we're going to want to make sure that the clearinghouses we regulate meet the equivalency standard in Europe, that they are high enough standard. And also, we're going to look to ultimately negotiate international arrangements. The statute does give this commission and the SEC authority to negotiate international arrangements for information sharing. And we want to make sure that that can be done in a way that regardless where a data repository is, that information can be shared amongst regulators. I know that Commissioner Sommers also put on this agenda today to talk about foreign boards of trade, so that's a very important matter. I think that we have, I can't recall, 15 or 20 foreign boards of trades that currently have no action regimes, and as we move forward with rule writing in that area, it'd be very helpful to hear people's thoughts on that. So again, I thank you. I thank everybody for being here.
Commissioner Dunn?
Thank you, Madam Chair. The world we live in today is smaller and more interconnected than at any time in our history. Financial events taking place in the United States are like skipping stones across oceans, sending ripples through markets in Europe and Asia. The United States cannot stand alone in an effort to bring transparency to the over-the-counter markets and in crafting best practices for risk management in the financial industry. If we are to make financial reforms meaningful and effective, we must tackle this issue hand in hand with our sister regulators and the world. Only together can we accomplish the ultimate goal of creating a secure, stable, and productive global financial system. I would like to thank Chairwoman Sommers and her staff for all the work in this area. The panelists she has assembled here from throughout the financial world to discuss the new OTC and clearing paradigms is impressive, and I look forward to hearing the thoughts of our distinguished speakers. As the world reacts to recent financial crises that threaten everyone's economic stability, it has become apparent that prudential regulators from all countries need to better communicate and harmonize their efforts. Additionally, I would like to welcome Kathleen Casey to this meeting as the past chairman of the IOSCO Technical Committee and work on the FSB. Her insights in today's topics will undoubtedly be very, very valuable. I'd like to recognize the tremendous work done by our Office of International Affairs under the leadership of Director Jacqueline Mesa. Although understaffed, this office has done an excellent job at representing the CFTC around the world. Lastly, I would like to thank Chairman Gensler for all his efforts in advocating for greater international regulatory oversight and harmonization. And I urge him to get to Japan soon. As we begin to implement the Dodd-Frank legislation, I would again stress the importance of U.S. regulatory agencies working in concert with regulators around the world as opposed to acting unilaterally. The world's bodies, such as the G20, the FSB, and IOSCO, are already working on financial reform, and it is imperative that we understand the directions they are heading. I am hopeful at today's meeting that the GMAC members will be able to shed some lights on actions taken internationally and share their concerns and recommendation with this Commission. My hope is that regulatory cooperation between countries with substantial assistance from market users will lead us to developing a set of compatible financial regulations used throughout the world. Only by working together can financial regulators create an adequate structure for the over-the-counter markets that promotes stability and transparency, while at the same time discourages any type of regulatory arbitrage. Thank you all for your participation today.
Thank you, Commissioner Dunn. Commissioner Chilton?
Thanks. Thank you all for being here. Good afternoon. I could echo what both Chairman Gensler and all of my colleagues have said so far, but I'll put it a little bit different way, and then I have something that's different. This watch that I have, it's one of my favorite watches. It's an Omega that is similar to that Neil Armstrong wore on the moon, and there's a picture of it actually from the moon of Buzz Aldrin, because Neil Armstrong's the one that had the camera on the front of his spacesuit. And so you can see Buzz Aldrin with this watch. Dave Staywick, who's our secretariat here, is our expert on space, and he has one of them too. But those pictures that Armstrong took of the world, of the Earth, from up in space, made it look so small, and you could see Europe and North America, and you could see Africa and Asia. And even though we have folks here that have come from London, Anthony, maybe Jeff, and from Asia, our friends from Japan, in a trading world, it is really microseconds away. It's a small world, as they say. And that's why what we're doing here is so important. It's nice that we have, we've moved forward on our law, and others have moved forward. But as the flash crash report taught us last week, these markets are really interrelated, or interrelated domestically in the U.S., but had that crash happened earlier in the day when the European markets were open, there could have been It could have rocked the global financial world. So we're inextricably linked. So I agree with all my colleagues that we need to work better to go forward on parallel, not necessarily identical, but parallel policy objectives, at least. What we don't want to happen is have regulatory arbitrage. That is sort of a race to the regulatory bottom, where traders go to the least transparent and the least regulated place. I don't think that'd be good for anyone. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that we reached sort of a milestone in the U.S. This week, and it was the end to the Targeted Assets Relief Program as we know it. Nobody can come in and get bank bailout funds anymore. It's still not paid off yet, but we can't make them anymore. So it comes to us and our brethren at the SEC to ensure that whatever we do under the new law doesn't have a new systemic risk, doesn't have the possibility for a new bailout. And by that, I'm specifically concerned about what we do with clearinghouses, that we need to ensure that they're safe, sound, and secure, and that they aren't a place where taxpayers could ultimately have to bail out these things. And quite frankly, even though we have the wherewithal to provide the regulatory constructs to set up good clearinghouses, safe, sound, secure clearinghouses, we may not have the money. And so a lot of us talked about this in the last several days, about how imperative it is for us to have the money, so not just to ensure that we're meeting the intent of Congress with regard to the Wall Street Reform Act, but that we're protecting taxpayers with regard to ensuring we don't set up new systemic risk in the form of clearinghouses. So thank you again for being here. I know it may not seem like a small world when you have to travel 20 hours, but we appreciate the fact that you're with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Chilton. Commissioner O'Malley.
Thank you for all our participants, guests from Europe and Japan. Mr. Chairman, if it's any consolation, I did go to Japan, but I made you pay for it. So you were well represented.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Malley.
My colleagues have obviously stated the importance of working internationally and cooperatively to implement the detailed reforms passed by Japan and proposed by Europe, as well as the reforms that have been implemented here. And I look forward to continued dialogue to make sure that our regulations are harmonized to ensure that we're able to mitigate systemic risk, increase transparency through trade reporting, and continue to provide cost-effective solutions for the management of risk. I'm going to end here. I want to just reiterate my strong support. Glad you're having this hearing. Compliment our CFTC staff for their participation. Jackie, your staff for keeping us well informed on international matters. And I look forward to the presentations today.
Thank you. GMAC was created over 12 years ago to provide a forum for the Commission so that we could hear from market participants regarding the globalization of futures markets and to discuss regulatory and competitive issues. At that time, screen-based trading was just in its infancy. And although so much has changed over the past decade, it's always been important for this Commission to participate in international organizations and to coordinate with our colleagues around the globe regarding futures regulation. I think all of those efforts have been very successful, and now it's time for us to build upon those relationships and to participate in global consultations on regulations for the OTC derivatives markets. We'd like to create a transparent and sound regulatory environment around the world. The products are different, and they may not fit into the regulatory models that we're all very familiar with and that we're operating under now. But many of the issues that have been identified, such as clearing, standardization, trade repositories, data collection, all require close coordination between the regulatory agencies to determine the appropriate policy response. And that's why I believe it's so important that we have both the European Commission and the Japanese FSA, as well as the SEC here today with us to discuss these important issues. I'd now like to turn to Patrick Pearson, who is the head of Financial Markets Infrastructure Unit at the European Commission, for him to give a presentation on the legislative proposal that was introduced, I think, September 15th formally. Patrick.
Thank you, and thank you to the chair of the GMAC, Commissioner Sommers, and the other commissioners of the CFTC for this invitation. I don't have an expensive watch like Commissioner Chilton. I have one, but it's not.
I didn't say it was expensive. It was just unique.
Believe me, sir, it's expensive in its uniqueness.
I went to Japan also.
But I'm encouraged by your words and your inspiration, and Commissioner Dunn as well. And without an expensive watch and coming from the old world, all I have to carry with me are words. And so I'll inject some of my comments with the words that I bring with me, and I'll try and give you some inspiration from Shakespeare as we go along. And you know what I was doing 8 hours in the aeroplane yesterday. It was not reading Dodd-Frank, it was brushing up my Shakespeare. Let me start off with a quote from Julius Caesar when he said, "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears." And I think that is quite appropriate today, because what we're discussing today is not a small matter that is restricted to one or two of our jurisdictions. It's something that actually, I believe, is of importance to everybody around the table, everybody in this room, and many other people beyond this room. The regulatory responses to some of the mishaps and the misfortunes we encountered in mid-2007. The word regulation is quite appropriate because in July, as you said, the US Congress passed Dodd-Frank. 2 weeks ago, the European Commission released its regulatory proposal on OTC derivatives, on swaps. And these are regulations. You call yours an act, we call ours a regulation, but these are legislative statutes because nothing can come of nothing. And that was Lear, by the way. We need a regulatory response because these are issues that require public authority and public leadership, and self-regulation in this area, we believe in Europe, we believe also the G20 is quite clear about, will not deliver what we're looking for. In our proposal 2 weeks ago, we identified 3 important priorities. Regulate the dealers, require standardized derivatives to be cleared by regulated clearinghouses, and thirdly, require all trades to be reported to registered trade repositories. Now you will say there is something missing. That's true, because that proposal is part of a triptych of measures, 3 measures, not 1. There will be 2 other regulatory measures in Europe. The first is to regulate trading, require standardized swaps to be traded on transparent trading venues. We're working on that. There'll be consultation, impact assessment in the next 3 months, and a legislative proposal beginning next year. And the legislative proposal will be called MiFID review. We don't have sexy acronyms, but people really should understand the importance of the MiFID review beginning next year. That is where we will regulate the trading, that is where we will regulate position limits and a host of other measures. And there is a third measure, and that is capital. And that is require the banks to meet higher minimum capital requirements for non-cleared trades. This is part of the revision of the Basel Agreement, Basel III. And that third proposal will be put on the table at the end of this year. So, unlike Dodd-Frank, there will be 3 regulatory measures in Europe. So there is method to this madness. And the connoisseurs know that was Polonius from Hamlet, but there you go. There's method to this madness, and it is quite important because there is some misunderstanding. There are those who say Europe is not moving in tandem with the United States. There are things missing from our regulatory approach. That is wrong. We're doing things differently for different reasons, but the idea is to end up in the same space. Before I make some preliminary remarks comparing Europe, the USA on swap regulation, 2 initial comments. The first is past is present, the famous Shakespeare quote, and quite important because we're all at the global level seeking solutions to the same problems, because we suffered the same consequences as colleagues in the United States, Japan, and other parts of the globe. The same regulatory failure, the same regulatory myopia, and the same economic downturn. so we're in this together. My second comment is Europe and the United States of America have different regulatory systems. We have different institutions. My point is, keep your eye on the ball. There are a lot of people out there who are trying to make a living out of finding differences between our regulatory approaches. And I agree with the commissioners. The one thing we cannot afford is a different regulatory outcome. My advice to you is focus on the product, not on the process. Focus on the product, not on the process. And look at what the words on paper say in the different jurisdictions. Then come to a judgment whether Europe and Japan and other parts of the globe and the US are different or not. Keep your eye on the ball, look at the product and not the process. My first point is, what we're trying to do in Europe is increase safety in the system, regulate the dealers. How are we going to do that? 4 points. First, the rules that we put out last week, 2 weeks ago, cover the entire product suite for clearing and reporting of swaps. The entire product suite. That means interest rate swaps, currency, commodity, equity, and credit default swaps. The whole suite. No exception. Same as in Dodd-Frank. Secondly, we want robust margining requirements, real margining requirements, fully collateralized, at least intraday collection, similar to Dodd-Frank. Thirdly, the bilateral, the non-cleared transactions. We're all aware of the fact that there is only so much you can standardize. There is only so much that can be cleared. For the uncleared transactions, we will require margin or capital, mark-to-market daily, robust risk management arrangements against op risk, operational risk, and credit risk, electronic confirmation, portfolio reconciliation, obviously, dispute resolution. And this is where it's interesting to look at what Dodd-Frank says, because the only difference we've been able to identify is that where we say we want margin or collateral, Dodd-Frank says margin and collateral. Interesting. But that's as far as the difference goes. Section 731 for the connoisseurs of Dodd-Frank. Segregation. Both Europe and the US require segregation. In Europe, you must have segregation. In the US, you may have segregation, but held at an independent custodian. So they're similar approaches. And my fourth point on regulating the dealers is address conflicts of interest. Absolutely critical if you look at the European regulation. You have 6 whole provisions in that text on conflicts of interest. We focus on governance, we focus on ownership. We want shareholders and clearing members with a significant interest to have regulatory approval. Intrusive. That means any major shareholder that wishes to acquire more than 10% or 20 or 30% in a CCP must have regulatory approval, subject to very clear conditions. Are there conflicts of interests? Is the ownership conducive and propitious to the safety in the system? And the regulators will have the power to not approve ownership if it impinges on the sound and prudent management. We also want all of our clearinghouses to have very clear and public and transparent written arrangements to identify potential conflicts of interest. So again here, very, very similar to Dodd-Frank. There's one issue that is not similar, and that is the power, the proposition that the regulatory authorities in the US may introduce ownership caps and limits. We don't have that, but if that's the only difference, I ask you, how big a difference is that? Well, let's move on to a second point. Mandatory central clearing. What are we going to do in Europe? Require central clearing of all eligible contracts. All eligible contracts. Dodd-Frank does the same. It just calls it clearable contracts. Why didn't we use the word clearable? Because we were told by the Brits that it's not an English word. It doesn't exist in the dictionary. I reserve my judgment, but we were told the word is eligible. If that's the biggest difference. In Europe, the regulation applies to all eligible contracts of specific counterparties. Very simple. And that is quite important, though. If you look at the first provision in the European law, its point of departure is to regulate the entities, the counterparties. It says that every single bank, savings bank, cooperative bank, mutual, investment bank, life assurance company, non-life assurance company, pension fund, hedge fund, every regulated financial entity in Europe will be subject to the clearing requirement. Juxtapose this to Dodd-Frank. It doesn't use the regulatory entity approach. At the beginning, it focuses on the swap contract. Is that a big difference? No. It's a different regulatory point of departure, but where we end up is in exactly the same space. So why didn't we use the US approach? Very simple. Because in our discussions with the US Treasury and with the Congress, it became very clear to us that the US regulators had to follow that approach based on the swap contract, for the reason that they had a lot of difficulty in using the point of departure of the regulated entity because the legislation simply wasn't in place at that time. In Europe, it's much easier to focus on the departure of the regulated entity because we have all of that legislation in place, and it's very easy to build on that building stock, that building block. Dodd-Frank allows commercial end users to opt out of clearing. Fine. We only require clearing for commercial end users if positions exceed a threshold, a different point of departure, but we end up in the same space. For a number of reasons. First, through the back door, the commercial entities can be required to clear if they're considered to be major swap participants. In Europe, commercial entities can be required to clear if they meet a certain threshold. The whole idea is that the European threshold and the definition of major swap participants in the end converge. So you have a different way of achieving exactly the same objective. And Europe and the USA are analogous as well. If you look at the European legislation, if you look at Dodd-Frank, by excluding corporate exposures that are directly linked to their commercial activity. Exactly the same approach in two jurisdictions. And a final point. The process and the framework for determining which contracts must be cleared, so clearable or eligible, are remarkably similar in both regulatory approaches. CCPs can submit for regulatory review the contracts they seek to clear. Same approach in Europe, same approach here in the US. And regulators are authorized to identify additional contracts to mandate for clearing, even if they're not already cleared by a CCP clearinghouse. Same in Europe, same in the US. Different words. The US legislation is slightly more lengthy and laborious and has several sub-sentences which reek of Teutonic drafting in Germany to us in Europe. But they all say the same thing in the end. And the criteria the regulators have to take into consideration in determining clearing eligible and clearable are remarkably similar. Look at the texts. The same criteria, with one difference. Dodd-Frank adds an additional criteria, or two. First, there has to be an effect on competition. We don't have that criterion in Europe. Why not? Because we don't need it. Because we have an autonomous competition power under the treaty for the Commission to intervene in cases of negative effects on competition. The second difference, the only difference we could find when ploughing through chapters 7 and 8 of Dodd-Frank, was the existence of a significant outstanding exposures. That's the only difference in comparing the clearable and the clearing eligible approaches between Europe and the US. Remarkably similar. I'll move on to my third point, and that is regulation of CCPs, because if mandatory clearing comes around, we will shift significant amounts of swap contracts onto CCPs. We will not be removing risk from the system, we will be moving risk in the system. We will be moving risk from the bank's books to the clearers. That's good, that's fine. That's what we want. That brings safety to the system. We never again want to be in a position where liquidity dries up because financial institutions have no confidence in each other. We move the risk off the books of the banks into the CCPs. That raises one problem, and that is, from our perspective in Europe, these clearinghouses must be able to withstand financial Armageddon. They must be absolutely safe, absolutely sound. The words of Commissioner Chilton a moment ago. And that is why, if you look at the CCP standards enumerated in the European regulation, are pretty detailed. They're in fact one area of regulation where Europe is more detailed than the US, far more detailed. We will require minimum capital. We will define what the capital is. We will define margin requirements. We will require horizons. We will require default waterfalls. We will require a mandatory default fund, and so forth, and so forth, and so forth. In Eurospeak, we harmonize the regulatory licensing requirements for CCPs to the very, very highest standard possible. But it remains to be seen if that difference between the European legislation and Dodd-Frank continues as colleagues in the SEC and the CFTC work out this in rulemaking in the US. And why is that important? Well, I'll tell you why. Although we have broadly similar rules for CCPs, we need to have more convergence in this area because of the slightly different approaches that Dodd-Frank and the European Union apply to regulating foreign domiciled CCPs. There are 2 points. Because Dodd-Frank's registration requirements apply to all CCPs regardless of the location. And the CFTC, the SEC, can exempt a CCP from registration if it's subject to comparable, comprehensive supervision and regulation. So far, so good. In Europe, we require CCPs established outside of Europe to be recognized subject to certain conditions, including the determination that the CCP is subject to equivalent standards. So again, you see remarkable convergence in how we approach this. The United States uses the laborious terminology comparable, comprehensive supervision and regulation, and in Europe we have one word, equivalent, which means exactly the same. So it's quite important that those details in Dodd-Frank to ensure the safety and soundness of CCPs are comparable and comprehensive and equivalent to what we have in Europe. A last point on regulation of CCP, segregation and portability. What we will introduce in Europe are a couple of very important things for CCPs, clearing members, and obviously for the clients. CCPs will have to segregate their own assets from those of the clearing members. Pretty simple, pretty obvious. We want CCPs to segregate the assets and positions between the clearing members for pretty good reasons. We want the clearing member itself to segregate its assets and positions from those of its clients for pretty good reasons. We've seen some bad things happen over the past 2.5 years. And we want CCPs to give the option to clients for more granular segregation. The option. Disclosing the risks, disclosing the costs. It's cheaper to have an omnibus account, we know that, but we want the clients to have the option for greater granularity in the segregation. And portability. We will want CCPs to be able to transfer assets and positions between the clearing members. Now, many have said this is pretty hairy because this touches on bankruptcy rules and regulations. And it's difficult enough in the US where you have one bankruptcy code. Come to where I live, where I have 27 bankruptcy codes. This is where you see a phenomenal power of European regulation. There is one sentence in Europe's regulation that says, we don't care. We say, you will allow a CCP to transfer assets and positions between the clearing members, regardless of whatever any national bankruptcy law says. So the European law overrides any contradictory requirement in national law. Segregation and portability, similar, not identical, but very similar to the approach considered in the US. And that brings me to my final point, increased transparency. We've spoken about clearing, we've spoken about the need to regulate the dealers, the clearing mandate, the regulation of CCPs. I want to talk about transparency, trade repositories. Now, like Dodd-Frank, Europe will require the reporting of trades into a trade repository. No difference, except the scope of the reporting requirements differs slightly at this point in time. You see, Dodd-Frank requires all trades to be reported to a trade repository. Europe exempts those contracts, those trades, between two corporates. A trade between two corporate entities is exempt from a reporting requirement. And that's quite interesting, because the comprehensive approach in Dodd-Frank, where even a corporate contract would need to be reported to a trade repository, is not followed in Europe. And why is that? Two reasons. The first, when we did our impact assessment and we spoke to the corporates, it was very clear. Most of the contracts are between two financials or between a financial and a corporate. The financial corporates, I think we're looking at 17.3% of the contracts as at the end of last year. The corporate-to-corporate contracts we found were almost difficult to find, if at all. They do exist, but they're absolutely minimal in their volume. And the impact assessment determined that the cost-benefit analysis of requiring these corporates to put a reporting framework in place would be disproportionate. So they're exempt at this point in time. Time frame for reporting, anything as long as it's not longer than 24 hours. And that could be, I don't know, 5, 10, 15 minutes for block trades, up to 24 hours for more complex trades. Now, the further details of the report, the format, the content, these will be subject to what we call implementing rules in Europe. And that's pretty important, that these rules are very similar to what the SEC and the CFTC put in place. Because what use is it if European counterparties report trades to a trade repository in a slightly different format than those reported in the US or in Japan? So that reporting format, the reporting framework, must be absolutely similar. I mean, convergence doesn't cover the term there. They probably have to be as similar and identical as possible, with one objective: to allow the regulators, to allow the market to have a comprehensive overview of the risks and the position in the system. On trade repositories, we've got some pretty granular and detailed rules to regulate them. We have rules on governance, we have rules on systems, we have rules on senior management. They've got to be fit and proper. We have rules on access, we have rules on price disclosure, we have rules on fee disclosure, including discounts, including rebates. We have rules on safeguarding, we have rules on record keeping for trade repositories, we have rules on transparency, and we have rules on data availability. And both Dodd-Frank and Europe require registration of trade repositories. No difference. The only difference is that Europe allows third country trade repositories, and there's one I can think of in Europe, in the US at this point in time, to be active in Europe, provided it's recognized as being subject to, again, equivalent regulation in its home country. So we've got exemptive relief for trade repositories coming into Europe. And digging through Dodd-Frank, we found one other area where there is a slightly different approach. There is no exemptive relief for trade repositories in the US. So there's a possibility of double registration requirements for at least 4 European trade repositories wishing to do their services in the United States of America. And one final comment, and this is quite important. European regulation proposes the existence of an international agreement between Europe and third countries for mutual access to information and exchange of information in a trade repository. And again, there is method to that madness. This harks back to March of this year, where there was an unfortunate hiccup and some unfortunate events where a number of European regulators had some difficulty in accessing information in a trade repository outside of Europe. And the very, very, very clear comment from our Congress and our ministers was, this is once, but never, ever again. So when you look at this, what were the options we were faced with in Europe? Require all trade repositories to locate in Europe? It's a pretty simplistic approach, but if you look at it, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. And that's why the option that we've put in the proposition, the regulation, is you don't have to have a location requirement as long as there is a guarantee, an international arrangement with third countries, that there is a guarantee that the regulators can access that information in a trade repository, even if it's located outside of Europe. And I'm encouraged by the comments from Chairman Gensler that he has the locus to actually engage in this type of arrangement. Very, very important. I'll conclude. I have four 4 comments to leave with you. Europe and the US are very, very similar in scope, application, and requirements. Are there differences? Yes. Frankly, I wouldn't only be surprised, I'd be pretty annoyed if there were no differences, because it means that we couldn't implement half of Dodd-Frank in Europe, A, because it's not proper English, according to my native English speakers, B, because it used words we have no idea what they mean, but we will be enlightened by the SEC and the CFTC as to what some of these words mean, like CEFs and MSPs and what have you. But I'll tell you one thing. I not only read Shakespeare yesterday on the flight coming over, you got a pretty good idea that I was also plowing through Dodd-Frank. And I actually had to detect the differences with a mag light. I flew business class, I have one of these strange lights that come out of the seat, and you have to really, focus it as a LED light on the text. I had a great deal of difficulty finding the differences between our piece of legislation in Europe and Dodd-Frank. You really have to go through this with a mag light. So the differences I've just indicated to you are really not fundamental. They're in detail, and I'm quite sure that some of the differences probably came through regulatory mishap. Speaking to some of the staffers and the congressmen, there was a lot of pace and speed in the final days of the regulation in Congress. And I'm quite sure, I've been told, some of the differences actually were because of the need to get this text out and agreed in the US. But a lot of these differences can be considered. There is room and scope to minimize these differences even further as our work on implementing rules continues on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, my second point is we're converging. We are not competing. Convergence, not competition in regulation. And we are looking closely at the SEC and the CFTC rules as they develop to ensure there is consistency. Consistency between Europe and the US, and wider, the G20, the Financial Stability Board, IOSCO, Commissioner Casey, important work to do in the IOSCO framework on ensuring that consistency not only occurs between Europe and the US, but also on a much wider frame in the G20. We're in this together. This is a global market and it needs a global response. Timing issues have been overstated. I've seen these comments in the press and in the public arena. There is no timing issue. Will Europe be ahead of America? Will America be lagging behind the European Union? This is not a race. This is a marathon. And the marathons that I run, with my lousy condition, we all usually end up finishing the finishing line at the same time. We never have winners in my marathons. This is a European regulation. And for the lawyers in the room, there is a difference between a regulation and a directive in Europe. If Europe had put forward a directive, we would have had to give the European member states 18 months to implement that in national legislation. This is a regulation, not a directive. If our Congress and our ministers agree with this text, it becomes the law of the land immediately. The regulation is the law, directly invocable by any stakeholder before any national court in 27 countries in Europe, or before the Court of Justice of the European Union in Luxembourg. Speed is not of the essence with a regulation. Getting it right is. My third point is cooperation works. Believe me. The CFTC, Commissioner Gensler, his staff, the SEC, Commissioner Casey, I think the thin threads of discrete mutual cooperation that we started spinning a year ago are turning into a wide banner of international regulatory cooperation. It is no coincidence that there are so few differences between Dodd-Frank and between what Europe is coming up with. That's that wide banner of international regulatory cooperation. The CFTC, the staff, the SEC have been interoperating so much that I can tell you that the CFTC and the Commission offices by the staff is actually called the Concrete Financial Transatlantic Cooperation Outfit. So you have a new terminology there, Chairman Gensler. My fourth and final point is I've heard many regulators and stakeholders in the past 23 years that I've been regulating banks, insurance companies, and now market infrastructure. I've heard many regulators and stakeholders talk about regulatory cooperation and regulatory convergence. This is the first time in 23 years, I've actually seen it happen. And I'm proud to say that I think if you look at the text, if you look at the approach that we put on the table today, I think it will actually deliver the benefits that we're all looking for. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick, so much for your overview and your insights on that. I'm now going to turn to our colleagues from the Japanese FSA, and Mr. Sumi, who's the Deputy Commissioner for International Affairs and Competitiveness at the Japanese FSA, for an overview of their legislative proposals.
Thank you, Ms. Sommers. Ladies and gentlemen, well, somebody said the computer signals travel around the globe in split seconds, but the Boeing 777 isn't that fast. And I got off an airplane after 13 hours flight 3 hours ago, and I'm still operating at the Japan Standard Time, which is 3 a.m. in the morning. So please allow me not to quote Shakespeare. And I confess I didn't read Dodd-Frank in the plane either. I couldn't resist watching the Die Hard 4. All right, so this is the, let me start with the starting point, the Pittsburgh Summit. That was last September. And after about 2 months' time of this Pittsburgh Summit declaration, we submitted a draft bill to the Parliament, which of the Financial Instrument Exchange Act amendment of the 2010, which was submitted to the Parliament sometime in March and passed in May, which was quite fast for considering the Japanese political situation. So that this was not partisan, and this was pretty much agreed upon in light of the importance to do our part in order to contribute to the global financial stability. This Financial Instrument and Exchange Act, by the way, is in a sense omnibus legislation. It has a very broad range of, covers broad range of financial activities, amendment of which is takes place almost every year. So you can't say that it's as shattering as the epoch-making as the Dodd-Frank. It's more or less sort of annual housekeeping sort of amendments. But nevertheless, the content of the amendment was no routine. This 2010 amendment of the FIEA aimed at CCP clearings and some mandatory clearing at domestic CCPs for derivatives transactions that are closely related to Japanese bankruptcy procedures. And unrelated to this particular topic of today, we also did to strengthen the group-wide regulation and supervision of financial instrument of so-called SIFIs, given the fact that the SIFIs is a new notion that encompasses not only the banks, but also the financial institutions, regardless of the legal form. So, and also, as you may be aware, that in Japan, pretty much similar elsewhere, I believe, but the law is stipulated in a sort of broad brush language, and smaller, more concrete details are usually provided by the what we call Cabinet Office Ordinances. Cabinet Office Ordinances sound somewhat strange, but in essence, it's FSA's rule. But before the FSA determines upon that rule, we usually have a public comments, welcome public comments, and try to incorporate the public comments in the contents of this Cabinet Office Ordinances. So although we have passed the law, and that's content of which I'm going to explain from now, but much work is still needs to be done in the process of formulating this Cabinet Office ordinances. And during the process, we would like to listen to the industries as well as other regulators' comments in order to be compatible worldwide. The first point of the mandatory CCP clearing, we have a system to designate the particular the types of derivative transactions. In a sense, we have a system of positive listing. I understand that U.S. regulation has, or the EU regulation encompasses the clearable or eligible, whatever the correct English language would be, but has a sort of exemption granted by the FTS, by the authorities. In a sense, it's a negative listing. It takes up the broad derivative as a whole, but allows some exemption in a sort of negative list. But ours is a positive list. And at this time, of course, we in designation, we will consider the market size and liquidity of that particular type of the derivative transactions and the regulatory approaches by other regulators. So at this time, the plain vanilla type yen-denominated interest rate swaps are sure to be included, but what else, if any, will be included or not will be determined, like I said, in the light of the market size and what the other regulators do in the rest of the world. And another particular feature is that we have one article which says a certain type of OTC derivatives has to be cleared at domestic CCPs. Other types, usually, although those derivative transactions which are subject to mandatory CCP clearing can be cleared either by the domestic or foreign CCPs, but for those derivatives which are very closely related to, which clearing criteria relates very closely to the bankruptcy procedures under the Japanese law, these are regarded as mandatory clearing at the domestic CCPs. For example, at present, iTraxx Japan index, CDS, is considered for inclusion. This rationale is that CPSS IOSCO consultative report on the OTC derivatives on CCPs stipulates that where as I quoted there, CDS-CCP should consider establishing an internal determination committee that may determine the credit events where no decisions are taken by the market participants. And this is one example that when we consider regulation, we take the CPSS IOSCO very seriously, and in order to achieve the internationally comparable or compatible regulation, we monitor very closely what's discussed and advised and recommended by the CPSS IOSCO. And the second point is the strengthening of the infrastructure for the central clearing. At this time, we do not have any minimum capital requirements for the CCPs. But as Mr. Pearson mentioned, that we do need to avoid the systematic risk or too big to fail kind of phenomena for the CCPs. So we would like to ask the CCPs to have a solid financial base, and thereby asking the minimum capital requirements, the exact amount of which will be determined by the law doesn't stipulate the specific amount, but rather the Cabinet Office Ordinance, the Cabinet of, or the similar subset rules to the law determines the specific amount. And also, in order to avoid the issue of conflict of interest, we would include the requirement for authorization for those to hold more than 20% of the voting rights of the CCPs. And also, the second point of the second is the foreign CCPs will be allowed to the Japanese market. Of course, foreign CCPs are welcome to establish a domestic or Japanese subsidiary, but even without doing so, the CCPs can provide the centrally clearing services to the Japanese financial institutions, through a linked system where foreign CCP set up a linkage with a Japanese domestic CCP and provide a service through that Japanese domestic CCP, or B, direct provision of their service. In which case, we do request the CCPs to acquire a Japanese license, but the rationale for issuing the license is that stipulated in that in the PowerPoint. Basically, we do ask the CCP, foreign CCP, to maintain an adequate infrastructure to operate appropriately and reliably during Japanese market hours. So I think the only binding part of this requirement is the underlying portion, during Japanese market hours. And also, we do ask that the foreign CCP is subject to proper supervision by its home country regulator. And this is the page 5 pertains to the reporting and the storing of the trade information data. We've made it mandatory for foreign institutions, financial institutions, to store and report trade information data for their OTC derivative transactions. However, if financial institutions use trade repositories, then the responsibility will be transferred to trade repositories, and financial institutions will be relieved of that responsibility. And if financial institutions use CCPs, again, the reporting and storing responsibilities will be transferred to the CCPs, and financial institutions themselves will be relieved of such responsibility. And these are basically the issues stipulated in the law, which passed last 18th of May this year. But this is the implementation schedule is stipulated on the page 6. The strengthening of the infrastructure of CCPs, including the minimum capital requirement and allowing entry of foreign CCPs, will take effect within 1 year of the promulgation of the law in May 18th this year, meaning that May 18th next year, 2011. And after that, the mandatory clearing and the storing and reporting requirement will take effect within 2 years and 6 months, meaning that November 18th, 2012, which of course we took into account that Pittsburgh Summit's mandate of starting this mandatory clearing by the end 2012. So this is basically how we have set up our law in the 2010 amendment of the Financial Instrument Exchange Act. But again, although the law is enacted, we still have work to do in order to make it work, to be implemented, meaning that we do need to stipulate the Cabinet Office ordinances. But again, As we do that, we will be putting it for public comment, and in doing so, we try to incorporate the other regulators' actions or the CPSS IOSCO's recommendations to make it compatible with the other major jurisdictions. And industry's comment will be also welcome at the public comment stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sumi, for being here and for that overview. I'd now like to open it up to our committee members or my colleagues, if you have any questions for either Mr. Pearson or Mr. Sumi on either the European Commission or Japanese legislative proposals. Jiro?
Hi, Jiro Kochi from Reva. Thank you for enlightening us more on the international legislation coming down. I guess, so if we understand then that the product may be the same at the end of the road, I think it still boils down to the very important details, which in derivatives, details are everything. So one clear difference may be on how both sides of the Atlantic and across the Pacific define commercial risk. So if commercial risk, the hedging of commercial risk is used to net down positions by non-financial counterparties or for large positions, I think that's a big open question on how that will be objectively viewed. Any comments on the approach to looking at how a counterparty may be hedging commercial risk?
For either one of you.
As the way the law is set up at this moment, as long as financial institution is a party to that derivative transaction, then even though the other party is non-financial, this contract is at this stage, we consider it included in this mandatory CCP clearing. However, if you to ask the non-financial institutions to be fully mandated to use the CCPs, then these corporations may be subject to the too heavy a burden of maintaining the CCPs. Therefore, depending upon other jurisdictions' actions and other IOSCO's arguments, we may consider exempting these non-financial corporations doing the transaction for the hedging purposes from this mandatory requirement. So it's at this juncture, we have a means to exempt them, and we have not decided either we are going to or we are not going to.
It's a very good question, and this is actually where I think Die Hard 4 and Shakespeare meet. I'll tell you why. I mean, you know Die Hard 4, Bruce Willis, he always starts off with a clean undershirt. It's always white. Have you noticed that halfway through the film, as if by miracle, it always turns green and black and dirty? But in the end, all actually works out well. There's always a happy end. It's a Hollywood film. And that brings me to the question, how is it possible that Bruce Willis's shirt that's so clean at the beginning gets dirty in the end, or halfway through, and in the end it all works out well? I mean, you watched the film yesterday. I've seen all of them many times. I love Bruce Willis to bits. But this brings me to Shakespeare, because Shakespeare, of course, wrote All's Well That Ends Well. We study this at school. At least I did, and you should have. So, but you know about All's Well That Ends Well. It's all about the bed trick. You know the bed trick? Well, I'll enlighten you a bit, because All's Well That Ends Well. Halfway through the story, the king allows Helena to marry the man of her choice, and she chooses Bertram, is an old heartthrob of hers. And Bertram refuses, and he says, I will only marry you, Helena, if you meet two conditions. You get a wedding ring on my finger, and you show me, Bertram, a child that I have fathered. So Helena embarks on her plot to pave the way to true happiness by using what's become to be known as the bed trick, which is why you should really read this. This is really interesting. Now, why am I making this point, apart from bringing some culture to this side of the Atlantic? It's because we have a bed trick. We have a bed trick as well in Europe. You have a bed trick over here as well. Because what is the point in calculating the position, the exposure of the corporates? We need to strip out all of those positions that are directly linked to the corporate activity, the underlying corporate activity. Makes absolute sense. We ran our impact assessments, and it's the only sensible way forward. The problem is, how do you determine when a position is directly linked to a corporate activity of the firm in question? And there's a huge potential, obviously, for arbitrage, because any company will say, I've taken this swaps position, I need it to cover my I don't know, my interest rate exposure or my currency exposure, so it's underlying my international business. Not true. The bed trick is that we had two options. The first was, let's use the international accounting standards. So we looked at the European accounting standards, hedging. No way, Jose. I mean, this was all over the place. It really didn't help us. So we looked to US GAAP and what have you, and we were even more shocked. That really didn't help us one bit. So we couldn't have a hedging requirement. You can't refer to hedging in the accounting sense to determine if the position is directly linked to the corporate activity. So we had a cunning plan. That's our bed trick. And the bed trick is we will have to define this in further regulatory guidance. Why is this a good bed trick? Because it makes no sense for us to come up with a different sense of regulatory guidance than the SEC and the CFTC on this side of the Atlantic. Because believe me, people, the corporates I'm speaking to, they're the same corporates you know over here in the United States of America. Caterpillar, John Deere, Rolls-Royce, Lufthansa. They're all international companies. And if the SEC and if the CFTC come up with a different definition from us in Europe, it's very, very simple to sort of see where this business will shift to and how the loopholes in the regulation will come around. So there you have it. That's how Bruce Willis in Die Hard 4 and Shakespeare come together. All's well that ends well. So I hope.
I was just going to say, I don't know from Helena or Bertram or anything like that, but we are working very closely with the Europeans, and I'll try to learn my Shakespeare, Patrick.
On my transatlantic flights, being of Irish descent, I tend to read Joyce, so I have a little darker outcome. And yesterday I wasn't watching Die Hard. I had one eye on the Ryder Cup, and that wasn't such a good outcome for us as well. I commend the EC on their win. Mr. Sumi, in your presentation, there's an asterisk there in which you say that the licensed foreign CCP will be subject to inspection and business improvement by Japanese FSA as well. And this has really been a great rub for us as we work internationally, and that is adhering to the national sovereignty of those home regulators. And I wonder, how do you go about that inspection in business improvement orders? Is that directly with the CCP, or are you looking at the home regulator to make those inputs for you? And then I would ask the same thing, Mr. Pearson.
If I may just answer your question first, we have a similar situation where, say, a bank sets up a branch in Tokyo, and that branch is subject to our inspection, and if there is a need, we may issue a business improvement order as well. But of course, in doing so, of course, this is a new one. So I'm talking about the existing example of banks. And if, say, Citibank establishes a branch in Tokyo, and then it's subject to both US and Japanese regulations. But of course, when dealing with these institutions, we have a contact with the home country regulator. And also, for many of the things, we can finish the business just talking with a home country regulator. But some of the things, this is, in a sense, as long as we license somebody, we do need to retain this, in a sense, right to do on-site inspection and to order something. But in actual working, of course, we do consult closely with the home country regulator.
So in your case, then that foreign CCP is required to allow you to come in and do the inspection and give that information directly to the FSA?
We do want to have the correct information reported to us. So if we think that the information is necessary, we are going to ask that foreign CCP to provide us with that information.
Patrick, could you...
I can be quite short, and the reason is there is no Shakespeare quote referring to Japanese inspections. There are two questions here, Commissioner Dunn.
Double bubble, toil and trouble wouldn't work?
There's probably one in James Joyce. But, is there equivalence, and what is the consequence? That's how we would look at this in Europe. Is there equivalence? What we will do is have a comparison. The comparison will be carried out jointly in the US case between the European regulators and the US regulators. We would consult, we would compare regulatory practices, and there would be a ruling from the European Commission that there is equivalence or not, but in our case we work on the presumption there's equivalence. The question is then, what is the consequence? The consequence from our perspective is not inspections, but the consequence is what we call mutual recognition. So we recognize the quality of the way in which regulation is carried out in a third country, in this case in the United States of America. The only thing we would require is a bilateral MOU of understanding between the European regulators and the Japanese regulators or the US regulators on a mutual exchange of information, but not the inspection part.
Commissioner O'Malley?
Thank you. Mr. Pearson, in your statement, you laid out the issue of segregation and providing for both an omnibus account and an individual account. I want to get a sense from you, would you leave that up to the FCM, the clearinghouse, to set those rules and get a little bit of input from our panelists on what they think, how that might be implemented and if that's feasible? And Mr. Sumi, if you have any thoughts on this, I'd appreciate those as well.
Absolutely correct, Commissioner. The way we've put this out is very simple. Segregation, we would require a clearinghouse, a CCP, to have the option of omnibus or further segregation. We're not requiring them to apply one or the other. That's just the option, so there is a choice for the clients. And in implementing this option, we would require the clearinghouse to give full transparency as to the extra risks you would run or not run when, as a client, you opt for one of the other permutations, and obviously the costs, because the client will, in almost all cases, find it cheaper to go for an omnibus rather than a further segregation. But the choice is up to the client. We can't regulate that choice into being. We can only regulate the need for there to be an option. So that's how we would approach it.
If I may, we will probably not have the specific rules regarding that. But since the CPSS IOSCO has a similar, certain rules for this segregation and portability, And when we look at, we do ask the CCPs to establish its own business rules, and in which if I find something incompatible with the CPSS IOSCO, we would ask them to correct that and to make it comply with the CPSS IOSCO. So that probably the way we work. Does that answer your question?
It does, thank you. I'd be interested in any of the panelists or the committee members, any thoughts they have on the European proposal.
Roger?
Well, just a comment related to it, which is that our sort of interest rate swap client clearing model allows for either. And we see no demand at all for the omnibus. And it is for the issue of portability. It's very, very hard to guarantee portability with omnibus. Well, in fact, it's impossible unless you port the entire defaulting member's portfolio in one block to a single successor clearer. So we feel very strongly as an organisation that individual segregation for OTC derivatives is the way to go.
Richard?
I think there is an important distinction to be made between the client demand in over-the-counter derivatives, which I think Roger correctly represents, and for listed derivatives. I think the pricing sensitivity on clearing is very different in the listed space, and particularly for some market participants who, whether they're in the high frequency or at least they are heavy users of the market, the costs of transaction is an extremely important part of their ability to participate in the market. I think, A, I strongly endorse the European approach to being a matter of choice. And secondly, I would say that I think it is important that we maintain a recognition that there is a difference in client preference in listed and over-the-counter derivatives.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If I could ask a question for Roger and Jeff and Tom, who I think maybe there's others who are representing clearinghouses, but just when you think about the clearing rules that may emerge in Europe, what you already have seen in Dodd-Frank, but we're embarking on rule writing, what is your perspective? Because you manage multinational platforms, all of which at some point will be regulated here in the U.S. by the SEC and CFTC. Well, maybe Roger's yours will be just at CFTC, but nonetheless, you'll be regulated here in the U.S. You may well be regulated in Europe and in Japan, so it'd be helpful to gain your three perspectives on clearinghouse rules.
I think, well, the three entities that you mentioned, we all, while we do compete, we compete with very high standards and have generally adopted the IOSCO standards. So certainly in the case of ICE, we welcome having some harmonized high standards for risk management because we don't want to compete on that level. And we see, I think, as I mentioned, the companies that are present today have already internally adopted those, and we would welcome regulators harmonizing that. Secondly, we do see regulators, we've long seen actually between the U.S. and Europe, the FSA and the CFTC cooperation in the case of our business. So there's very little difference in the current offerings that we have for both OTC and listed futures between the U.S. and Europe in terms of membership requirements, risk management requirements and such. The only differences that exist really are there because of the different bankruptcy regimes, but we see you helping to harmonize those even though there will continue to be different bankruptcy regimes. So I think we view the efforts between the agencies that are here today as being quite positive.
And just as you continue, do you envision to have within an asset class one clearinghouse, or one in Europe, one here, one in France, one in London, one here? I mean, just so as you, and Roger and Tom, you get a chance to think, well, Jeff has that tough question.
I think it would be nice if we could live in a world where a CCP could be located anywhere and recognized globally. It's going to take a while to get there. So in the case of credit default swaps, which is a very complicated product and to a certain degree has a pejorative view given what we've come through in 2007, we thought it was best to actually have independent clearinghouses that were locally regulated. In the case of listed products, it seems rational and to have a single domicile clearinghouse that has global standard. That seems more acceptable. So, for example, our UK futures clearinghouse has a DCO status here in the U.S. And with all the work that's been done between the FSA and the CFTC with respect to at least ICE's listed products, it does feel like that can work well. So I think, you know, we're at the first inning of the OTC market. I suspect it will potentially evolve towards the listed model, but it'll take a while to get there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only difference is the requirement under Dodd-Frank for the CFT regime for US clients, which on the one hand is a fairly significant difference. On the other hand, we'd already decided for our own sort of reasons that that was the model that we wanted to adopt in any case, so it actually isn't an issue for us.
Did you say the segregation regime or FCM?
The FCM.
FCM.
Yeah. So we absolutely see the biggest benefit being having a single clearinghouse globally rather than different ones regionally. I think the credit derivative product is an exception to that. I think that was rightly identified by the JFSA because of local bankruptcy issues and all sorts of sovereignty issues and you know, sovereign credit default swaps and things like that. So I think having regional clearinghouses for credit products has some logic to it, but for the rest, I think it would be a very, very significant backward step if we went down that path. But I mean, the adoption of our model for the US regime could actually become a little bit of a precedent. So, for example, there is not the equivalent in the Japanese market that I'm aware of. But I think if we are going to be successful at working with colleagues in Japan to achieve our ambitions, I think it's quite likely that we would have some regime that would result in domestic end-user clients having their collateral held onshore under local agreements subject to that local bankruptcy code. So I think adapting a global model for regional differences is the right way to go.
This is Tom Callahan from NYSE. You're next. We're in a bit of a unique position because, of course, we are, as we speak today, simultaneously constructing 3 new clearinghouses in 3 different regulatory jurisdictions around the world. One here in the U.S., New York Portfolio Clearing. We're also building a new clearinghouse in London and simultaneously a clearinghouse in Paris. So for us, harmonization of the rules and protocols between the regulatory jurisdiction not only makes our lives easier in terms of how we construct these new clearinghouses, but we believe a competitive advantage of our global exchange group will be ultimately to tie these together. So the bankruptcy issues that Roger raises are certainly real. Our initial plans are to have products siloed within an individual clearinghouse, but to the degree that we're able to evolve through these bankruptcy issues and draw them together, for us, it's a competitive advantage.
Thank you. We're now going to turn to
Jill.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Just one real quick one. Thank you. I'm sorry for slowing us down. I'm exceedingly encouraged by the parallel policies that you've talked about. Mr. Pearson, I had one quick one for you, and maybe there's a distinction without a difference, but I sort of thought as you were talking about clearing that there might be a little bit more texture there, but maybe I'm wrong. Were you suggesting that we should perhaps have higher standards as we implement our regulations that would go even further than Dodd-Frank? I mean, like others, we can put more meat on the bones of the laws. We have some discretion. The law constricts us in some regards, but were you suggesting that maybe we would want to go a little bit further?
No, Commissioner Chilton. I think the point is the meat on the bones, is make sure the threads are there in the fabric, and Dodd-Frank gives the SEC and the CFTC the locus and jurisdiction to put that meat on the bones.
Okay.
So we're interested to see how that pans out.
Thank you.
So now we're going to turn to brief updates on international organizations that are taking certain issues and their agenda items, coordinating global regulatory issues. And I'm going to turn first to Commissioner Casey for an update on last week's FSB meeting in Paris.
Well, thank you very much, Commissioner Sommers. And again, thank you for allowing me to join you all today. As has been noted by yourself and my colleagues here in the Commission of the CFTC and our colleagues from European Commission and Japan, consistency with respect to international standards in this area is going to be critical. And I would tell you that a tremendous amount of effort is underway, not least of which has already been articulated here. But one of the other key places where this is being coordinated is at the FSB level. As you all are very well aware, the FSB has been asked to play a central role in coordinating the implementation of international standards across jurisdictions, and so they play a key role in this area as well. So the focus of the Paris meeting was to talk about and to take stock in a lot of the progress that's been made on the reform agenda, in particular with respect to the G20 commitment to central clearing, trading, and trade reporting. And at the initiative of the FSB back in April of 2010, they established a high-level working group, which was intended to help facilitate this consistency. And so much of the meeting in Paris was focused on hearing and reviewing some of the draft recommendations that the working group has put forward. And we would anticipate that that paper would be approved and considered by the leaders in November. And I think that this paper in particular is going to be really quite helpful in providing a framework for consistency across jurisdictions. And again, I've been really pleased at, again, the engagement that you have. I know Patrick Pearson is one of the primary authors of the report. We're engaged with our CFTC colleagues and other jurisdictions in Japan as well. So I think that this will be a great contribution to helping to facilitate some of the issues that are being discussed here today. And I would just also note some of the other items that the FSB discussed on the reform agenda was obviously welcoming the Basel work, talking about, again, seeking consistency in helping to reduce regulatory reliance on credit rating agencies to address some of the cliff effects that we saw with respect to ratings being embedded in statutes and regulatory rules. Those were sort of the central focus of the FSB meeting in Paris. But I would say this work in particular is, and SIFIs as well, also dealing with too big to fail and trying to come up with principles for addressing systemically important financial institutions, again, in a internationally consistent manner. So I would anticipate, again, that the work that we'll see coming out of the FSB working group will be an important contribution to ensuring consistency in this area.
Thank you, Kathy. I'm now going to turn to Jackie Mesa, who's our Director of our Office of International Affairs, for an update on the IOSCO agenda.
Thank you, Commissioner Sommers, and thank you for inviting me to provide an update on IOSCO matters to this group. You know, I have to say, when Commissioner Sommers asked me to provide an update on IOSCO initiatives, I thought, wow, I might just put this group to sleep right before a break. But I have to say, maybe it's just my roots coming from the Midwest part of America, I never thought to infuse Shakespeare as a part to keep it a more interesting and lively presentation. That said, you're just going to get a sort of plain vanilla presentation from me today. As you can imagine, a lot of the initiatives happening internationally, as Commissioner Casey just presented, are around OTC regulation and ensuring that we have consistent approaches going forward. Actually, just last week in India, the Technical Committee of IOSCO approved a task force on OTC derivatives. That task force is chaired by the U.S., the CFTC and SEC, the U.K., and India. The three chairs put together a mandate, and a lot of that mandate is to take forward what is anticipated from the FSB report that you just heard about from Commissioner Sommers. I think the group is going to take forward additional analysis of exchange and electronic platform trading for OTC derivatives. It's going to separately work on data reporting and aggregation requirements so that there is a consistent approach on that front. And then the task force is going to endeavor to develop consistent international standards relating to OTC derivatives regulation in clearing, trading, trade data collection and reporting, and oversight of certain market participants. That's quite detailed, and as Commissioner Casey knows, we had a long discussion in Chennai, India last week about what does standards mean as opposed to principles. And I think I can tell you that the idea is that we go even beyond principles in this area because it's so important to harmonize and that we come up with a set of standards here. Finally, this task force is really going to serve as a central point where members can consult with each other in going through their own rule writing. And the U.S., of course, will heavily use this group for its own consultation during the rule writing process. Now, that sounds like a lot of work for an international group, and so you guys are probably thinking, oh, 5 years from now we're going to have a report from IOSCO. We're trying to reshape ourselves into something that moves a little faster. So we're going to do these reports separately and in a phased approach, but it is a very tight time frame. So we're hoping to turn these out before actually any country is finalized in their rules. Other IOSCO projects that sort of touch on the OTC world, there is an ongoing project on suitability standards in connection with complex financial products. This, of course, includes swaps, and the project really grew out of European Asian concerns regarding the Lehman mini bonds. It's a project that we support here in the United States and is an interesting one to go forward internationally. There's also a project on capital requirements, and that is limited at this point to comparability of capital standards throughout the world, and not going to set up a sort of a standard of capital requirements at this point, but just really a comparability approach. Also, of course, during the financial crisis, what came to light is that regulators and securities regulators with the prudential regulators weren't all feeding together in a process to identify systemic risk. So IOSCO in June 2010 actually developed a new principle and approved a new principle which regulators must implement on systemic risk. And it states that securities and futures regulators must contribute to a process to monitor, mitigate, and manage systemic risk appropriate to its mandate. IOSCO is now working on what does this mean. It seems very lofty, but what is the role of security and futures regulators in identifying risk in the system, and how will it contribute to a process to identify risk? Some sort of non-OTC projects, I would say, but that'll be of interest to you and IOSCO, is just last week another approved mandate is one on high-frequency trading. The technical committee approved this project to address concerns presented by such trading and to consider the regulatory responses. What this group will look at is the impact of high-frequency trading technologies and strategies on market operators, participants, investors, and regulators, and the possible impact of high-frequency trading on the orderly functioning of markets, including unique aspects that might facilitate manipulative practices. It's not per se manipulative, of course, to conduct high-frequency trading, but whether there are things that high-frequency traders might be doing that others are taking advantage of. And finally, of course, IOSCO will not forget the benefits of high-frequency trading, so have no fear that that will be a part of the report as an analysis of what high-frequency trading actually brings to the market. One topic that IOSCO has been working on that's been a subject to the debate of this group in the past has been direct electronic access. Some of you will remember that at the last meeting there was quite a lively conversation about this. IOSCO did finalize its report in the meantime, so I wanted to just highlight some principles that might be of interest to you. Basically, the principles for direct electronic access say that regulators should have appropriate policies and procedures in place to ensure that direct electronic access trades placed directly onto the exchanges by a customer do not pose undue risk to the market and to the relevant intermediary. I think the two most critical principles that I'll point out is Principle 6 on markets. It says that a market should not even permit direct electronic access unless there in place an effective system and controls to enable risk management for the fair and orderly trading. And then Principle 7 for intermediaries, that intermediaries, and this includes as appropriate clearing firms, should use both regulatory and financial controls, including automated pre-trade controls, which can limit or prevent a direct electronic access customer from placing an order that exceeds existing positions or credit limits on such a direct electronic access customer. So as you know, this goes a little bit beyond where the CFTC is at the present moment, but this is giving direction to regulators that haven't taken steps in this space before. A task force that the CFTC has co-chaired since 2008 and that we are actively doing work on is the Commodity Futures Markets Task Force. This started after the G20 really expressed concern over volatility in agricultural and oil markets and asked IOSCO to do work in this area. We issued a report in March 2009, but the G20 came back and said, please do more work. We're still concerned, but this time we're particularly concerned about oil market volatility. And even in the Pittsburgh communique, they gave us very specific instructions on going forward and what IOSCO needed to do. One was to collect, that all regulators should collect data to identify and monitor large concentrations on their markets, that they should collect related OTC oil market data, and that the regulators should be taking active steps to combat market manipulation, and that regulators around the world needed to publish more information to market participants. So in these 4 areas, this group has been taking forward this work in the last year. I think one of the more interesting areas was really on the OTC market, where regulators around the world did not have authority to, on their own, necessarily collect data. So we have participants in this group from Saudi Arabia to Dubai, to the major European, Canada, Brazil, et cetera. We worked with actually ISDA in this area to do a voluntary survey of the OTC market and oil. We had 41 participants, and the participants included the G14 major dealers, but also producers and buy-side firms participated. It's a snapshot of results, and it is voluntary and unchecked by the regulators. So with all those conditions, I wanted to preview some of the results that will later be in a report to the G20 for its November meeting. I think it's fairly interesting. 19% of the trades, and this is by deal count and not by volume, were conducted with a G14 counterparty. So I think what this tells us is that in the oil space, you're seeing something very different that you're not seeing maybe in interest rates and other financial derivatives. And that is that much of the trading is being done by the non-big dealers. And they're being done by, say, non-G14 to non-G14, a huge amount of trading. About half the trades, 55%, are done on exchange of all the participants. 19% of those OTC trades are cleared, but 27% remain uncleared, which I think is quite large because there is available clearing in this space as opposed to a lot of the other products. So you can see a lot of it remains uncollateralized, non-cleared. There's more on-exchange trading of the G14 members. There's more clearing of the G14 members than there are of the non-G14. So I think those are interesting. Beyond the survey that we will provide to the G20 to provide that transparency, the CFTC held a training program to provide information on how we put out our commitments of trader report to foreign regulators. There was very positive reception of that training, and we think that several regulators will follow with a similar commitments of trader report on certain markets. Additionally, the task force is working with cash market regulators, with price reporting agencies, and specifically Platts and Argus, who do put out prices that the exchanges use. So we're working on how these price reporting agencies affect the price of oil and whether there's proper oversight of them. And then finally, I just want a note of future work of this task force. There is a lot of press, I think, in Europe, and Patrick and Peter can speak to this, but around the world about ag markets. Now, it's sort of kind of shifts back and forth, whether it's oil or ag or both, but there's a great fear in the prices of ag markets being volatile and how that affects global economic recovery. I can anticipate at the upcoming G20 in November that this will be on the agenda for the world leaders, and not only will they focus on sort of what's happening in production and capacity, et cetera, but I am sure they will also focus once again on financial markets in this space. So more work to come, and we look to the industry to help us think through some of these problems.
Thank you, Jackie. I'm going to ask now if there's any final questions or discussions on this part of our agenda, and I might ask Mike Dolly, who's on the phone, if he has any questions, is able to break in.
I'm good, Jill, thanks.
Okay.
Sure. Just Patrick. Just in the European, or do you want me to call him Peter instead? Okay, Peter. No Shakespeare. One of the things that we have in Dodd-Frank are business conduct standards. Those business conduct standards go both to lowering risk of the swap dealers to the financial system, a lot of back office. And there's also business conduct standards on what I might call sales practices, how you interface with customers. Could you give us a sense, because I think some of that you may have taken up and some might be in later MiFID reform, but just if that'd be helpful.
No, we are indeed looking at this, but this is part of the MiFID directive, which is up for review at the beginning of next year, and also a separate piece of legislation which is called the Market Abuse Directive. So of course we have plenty of directives. The advantage is that each individually are much more readable than Dodd-Frank together.
So is the answer that you, on the sales practices, you're taking that up in these other directives? On the back office, some of those risk mitigation techniques might actually be in this package here. Okay, thanks.
For a number of years, I've pushed our international group very hard to get involved at both the IOSCO level with full membership and to have input into what goes on with the FSB after the G20 had indicated that that was the mechanism that they were going to use. And I want to publicly thank Commissioner Kelly for her work in that area. Commissioner Casey, excuse me, did an outstanding job at representing us here. But I'm wondering, Ms. Mesa, what opportunities does the public have for input as these things are being hammered out? It would appear to me that this group here has a great deal at stake here, and what type of input and when can they get their input into this process?
IOSCO, and I'll speak to IOSCO and maybe let Commissioner Casey talk about the FSB, but IOSCO has traditionally put out reports always in a consultative form first so that we can receive public comment from the industry. But about a year ago, or it's now been 2 years ago, we heard from the industry that that wasn't sufficient, that sometimes these reports just kind of went by, and they wanted to have early input into IOSCO's work. So IOSCO then set up a group that would meet, I think, twice a year to have outreach to IOSCO into even what they look at, what they should prioritize as work, but also to provide face-to-face feedback to the people leading the working groups. And so that has been going on for some time, but of course it can't be the world because it's a face-to-face meeting and it's supposed to be representative bodies of certain classes of industry. It's worked, but it's not perfect. So individual regulators like myself sometimes will shove these reports out and ask for feedback. And among everyone here who's so busy, sometimes we get that and sometimes we don't, depending on the topic.
Well, I think it's again, it's a really important point that you make, and I know that with the evolution of the work that's been undertaken by the FSB, there's been a tremendous amount of focus on the question of transparency. And as Jackie has noted, within IOSCO and other standard-setting bodies, like IOSCO, the Basel Committee, or IAIS, you have these processes which are intended to help facilitate putting out consultative reports, getting input from key stakeholders, having outreach efforts, all intended, again, to help inform the standard-setting bodies as they take these judgments. I would say in the context of the ongoing work that the FSB is undertaking and the working group on OTC derivatives in particular, again, the working group itself is comprised of the standard-setting bodies, So CPSS and IOSCO, and then also with the leadership of the EC as well. So to the degree that you have the standard-setting bodies also informing the higher-level principles that are being articulated by the FSB, and you have a mechanism whereby the work that's taken forward, the standard-setting work, is ultimately undertaken by the standard-setting bodies. You ensure that you have that kind of input at the technical level. So I think that going forward, though, it's going to be an important balance to keep in mind with respect to the very critical and important role that the FSB plays in terms of coordinating the efforts of standard-setting bodies and helping to direct and foster, facilitating reform efforts in a consistent manner. But I think it's also going to be important, therefore, that the standard-setting bodies themselves, because those processes ensure that you get that consultation and that transparency, that they also continue to play that frontline role. But I anticipate from hearing from a lot in the industry, and I know that letters have been sent to the FSB and otherwise, to try to ensure that there is some greater transparency and input into those processes. So I think in a forward-looking way, it's going to be really important that, that those issues continue to be addressed appropriately.
Is there any suggestions or comments by the GMAC on this particular issue?
If there are no further questions, we're going to take about a 15-minute break, but I want to thank Commissioner Casey for being here with us. I think it's really important as we are trying to coordinate closely with the SEC to have her here as we listen to our counterparts globally. So thank you. We'll take about a 15-minute break.
I want to find out who he thinks is going to win the playoffs.
We're going to go ahead and get started. For this part of the meeting, I'm going to turn to our General Counsel, Dan Berkovitz, for an update on Dodd-Frank rulemaking. In the packet of information that we sent to all of you, there is a comparison chart that compares Dodd-Frank to the European Commission proposal to the legislation from the Japanese FSA. And if you have any questions regarding that side by side on the Dodd-Frank issues, please direct them. I think Dan's the best person to answer those questions. As well as I think most all of you know that we have set up 30 rule writing teams to assist us with our rulemaking process in implementing Dodd-Frank. And if you have any specific questions regarding those 30 rule writing teams, Dan also is the appropriate person to ask those questions to. But I'm going to have him focus more on a presentation on international issues that are in the implementation of Dodd-Frank, and he has a presentation with regard to that. I also would be remiss if I didn't say thank you, because that side-by-side was a big effort on behalf of the staff of the Office of International Affairs and the General Counsel's Office. So thank you so much for putting that together for us.
Thank you, Commissioner, and I'd also like to thank Terry and Jackie and DCIO for the help on the presentations. As you've mentioned, I think we had prepared the side-by-side of the Dodd-Frank and the EU legislation, EC legislation, and the Japanese legislation, but the previous speakers, Mr. Pearson and Mr. Sumi, covered extremely well, and I don't think there's a need to go into additional detail. But I have to say, it did, on that point, it did bring to mind a quote from Shakespeare. And the quote from Shakespeare is actually from Macbeth, and I forget exactly who said it, but it's the scene where Lady Macbeth is urging Macbeth to kill the king. And that quote came to mind not because of the references to maybe the duplicative and ungrammatical words in the Dodd-Frank legislation or the ponderous way it was written, but it was actually, the quote comes to mind as a compliment to the presenters. If it were done when it is done, then it were well, it were done quickly. So I'm not going to go into the side-by-side, but we'd be happy to answer questions about it. I'm going to highlight some of the international issues in the legislation, some of the issues that probably most interest to the members of the GMAC. I'll cover the basic extraterritoriality issue. When does Dodd-Frank have application extraterritorially? And then mention some of the specific rulemakings that may touch upon international interests, and that would be the clearing and trading requirements, the swap data repositories, and the foreign boards of trade. I would note that David and Dwayne will follow me on the panel and give the presentation on foreign boards of trade, so I'll just mention that that's an issue without actually getting into it, and that'll be the following presentation. On extraterritoriality, generally the rule of statutory construction and application of U.S. law is that a statute will not apply extraterritorially unless there's an explicit statement of extraterritoriality within the legislation. We do have that statement in Dodd-Frank. The legislation itself states in Section 722D, and this is in the presentation, the new swap laws the law shall not apply to activities outside the United States unless those activities, A, have a direct and significant connection with activities in or effect on commerce of the United States, or B, contravene CFTC rules issued to prevent evasion of the Dodd-Frank Act. So the second prong is basically you can't go overseas, conduct your activities overseas to evade the domestic requirements. The first prong, direct and significant connection with activities in or effect on commerce of the United States, is very similar to a provision that's in the U.S. antitrust laws, direct and substantial connection with interstate commerce. And so in looking to the reach of the U.S. law, we look to the precedents in the antitrust law and see what the application of that standard has been. And our reading of the law really is it's a very broad application. This is a standard that the courts have granted U.S. authorities fairly significant extraterritorial application. So the precedents are for a wide reach and a broad reach of U.S. law under Dodd-Frank. The question is, does this require application of Dodd-Frank in every instance to the maximum extraterritorial reach possible under the statute or not? There is no bright line rule that says that the statute applies to its fullest extent in every single possible application. It could apply, or the agency may have, and we're looking at the very specific circumstances each individually may have application, or the Commission may apply it extraterritorially in those situations. So we're looking at the two questions for the various provisions in Dodd-Frank. Does the extraterritorial provision permit application of U.S. law, and should U.S. law apply in all those circumstances? Now, there's some circumstances where the statute is it provides clearer guidance than others on whether a particular provision, how a particular provision should apply extraterritorially. For example, there's no exemptive authority from swap or swap dealer. So we wouldn't be able to say, for example, swaps extraterritorially, are exempt from Dodd-Frank. There's no specific authority in the statute that way. Similarly, with respect to, as we'll talk about a little later, facilities, for example, DCOs or trade repositories, whether the U.S. could or could not exempt a DCO from a registration requirement on the presence of a comparable regulatory scheme. So the two facilities where we would have that authority would be CEFs, right? CEFs and DCOs, not trade. That's expressly not for trade repositories, but it is for CEFs and DCOs that we could consider whether to exempt from registration based on comparable foreign regulatory scheme. So we're looking at Dodd-Frank as we go through the individual rulemakings on a rule-by-rule basis, on a provision-by-provision basis in Dodd-Frank regarding extraterritoriality, and that determination will really be made on a rule-by-rule basis. We don't have a blanket rule to apply extraterritorial. Some of the rules that have international application or interest, and the speakers earlier, Patrick talked about the clearing requirement, for example, in particular, the word clearable. I think, too bad Patrick has left the room, although the word may not have existed prior to Dodd-Frank. I think maybe 30, 40 years from now, when the next edition of the Oxford English Dictionary comes out, it's going to be in there. And the first reference to clearable is probably going to be a speech by Chairman Gensler sometime in 2009. That'll be the first entry into the OED.
Are you suggesting that I brought this, I don't know what you want to call, Patrick would say, but a distortion of the English language?
The English language is very flexible, all sorts of new words and new terms all the time.
At least you're credited with strategery.
The 723A3 contains a clearing requirement, and clearable swaps must be submitted for clearing to a derivatives clearing organization registered with CFTC, and the CFTC is to determine whether clearing is mandatory for a swap. This is similar to the process that was outlined for the EC. The Dodd-Frank legislation provided that upon enactment, all the swaps currently being cleared by DCO are automatically submitted to the CFTC for determination of whether clearing should be mandatory. And the CFTC had to make a determination within 90 days. We have obtained, or we have been granted, extensions by a number of the clearing organizations, by all the clearing organizations that were clearing as of the date of enactment, to make those determinations. But the agency hopefully and intends to at this point proceed expeditiously and have as many of those determinations as possible on the date of the effective date of the act, which would be 360 days after enactment. So that these clearable determinations, a number of these swaps have already been submitted to the agency, and the agency would be working towards making those determinations in a timely manner. The trading requirement follows from the clearing requirement that clearable swaps must be traded on or through an exchange, a designated contract market, or a swap execution facility that is registered with the CFTC. We're doing rulemakings as well on the trading requirement and the CEF requirement, the CEF core principles. What are the core principles that a CEF needs to operate by? What is a CEF is one of the fundamental questions in those rulemakings, and we have had a roundtable on that. We're receiving many comments, and we would be coming out with a proposed rule sometime. The goal is to come out with a proposed rule on that sometime in the fall this year. The commercial end user exception from the clearing requirement. Commercial end users are accepted, or entities are accepted if they're not financial, if they're using the swap for hedging commercial risk, and if they inform the CFTC of how they are managing their risk. We shorthand refer to it as the commercial end user exception, but it's really an exception for entities that are not financial entities that meet the other two prongs of the test. And we're working on a rulemaking on that as well, and that will give more definition to exactly under what circumstances swaps do not have to be cleared. As I mentioned, the exemptive authority, this is one instance where Congress has spoken in terms of giving some guidance, not definitive, but some guidance on the extraterritorial application of the registration requirements for DCOs and CEFs. The legislation expressly provides that we have exemptive authority for a non-U.S. derivatives clearing organization or a CEF from registration if it finds that the CEF is subject to comparable comprehensive supervision and regulation by the appropriate governmental authorities in the home country. It doesn't require the exercise of that authority, but it provides the CFTC with discretionary authority. And the exempt DCO under those circumstances, were the CFTC to grant such an exemption, would be required to make available for inspection by CFTC and to be inspected by CFTC and make information available upon request. Would note that for swap data repositories, there is no similar exemptive authority. So the test really would be, did Congress intend this to swap data repository registration provision to apply extraterritorially? Is the CFTC, to what extent is the CFTC required to register a swap data repository that's located in a foreign jurisdiction? Another issue with the swap data repositories located in foreign jurisdiction is the access to the data. To what extent can foreign regulatory authorities or get access to the data in the swap data repository? Can they get it directly, or would it perhaps should they get it through the CFTC? And that's another issue that we are working through in the rulemaking process. I will leave the Foreign Board of Trade issue for the subsequent CFTC staff, for David and Dwayne, to discuss, and that's sort of an outline of some of the key issues. There's obviously a lot of issues embedded in these general topics. We have, as Commissioner Sommers mentioned, 30 rulemakings, and many of them touch upon these areas in one way or the other. Thank you.
Now is your opportunity to ask Dan anything you want to know about Dodd-Frank and our rulemaking process. Does anybody have any questions? Don?
So I have some questions and comments. One of the opportunities that's presented by this extensive rejiggering process that we're going through is to increase the number of market participants in these markets. So first of all, in my view, a swap which is cleared becomes economically equivalent to a future, and as I think everybody knows, there are a lot of market participants like my firm, like DRW, which are very significant liquidity providers in the futures markets. So I think that if in this process we miss the opportunity to encourage firms like mine to participate, we've missed an opportunity to reduce systemic risk and reduce the reliance on too big to fail institutions. And so in order to do that, I think that you have to focus on issues related to access, which cuts across a bunch of different rulemakings. And one of the issues is permitting or making it viable for independent FCMs to clear to participate as clearing members in these clearing houses, in these products. So I was wondering if you'd like to comment on that. One of the issues that keeps on being brought up on both sides of the Atlantic is that there's a strong preference for FCMs to also be in the dealing process in other words, to be able to participate in the default process. And it's my view that by precluding independent FCMs from participating as clearing members because they don't trade themselves, that you're potentially eliminating an entire group of market participants from coming in. So I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Hey, Don, can I, I'm not replying to your question, I'm asking you a question. But would you, as a potential market maker, be willing to participate in any forced allocation that if a clearinghouse had a defaulted member and couldn't, you know, there's a number of ways for the public, there's a number of ways for the clearinghouse to deal with it, but one sort of fail-safe is to say amongst their 20 or 30 or 50 members that they just then force the allocation on some pro rata basis of the defaulted members' positions?
Well, you know, in the Lehman process that the CME conducted, I think that we saw, you know, how a competitive auction process should function. We participated in that process and actually were the best bidder for 3 of the 5 Lehman futures portfolios. So, you know, we're very comfortable participating in that process. Now, that's a you know, kind of free market process, but that process should work.
But I was asking, and I do recall, you've disclosed it publicly, I knew it privately, that you participated in that, but would you also be willing, if the auction failed, to take your pro rata portion in a forced allocation amongst members? Because I think that's one thing clearinghouses have raised, some of them sitting at this table. And if you were able to, it might be able to loosen this discussion up quite a bit. Loosen it up amongst you and the clearinghouses, because for the public, the clearinghouses are right now excluding some, their membership is exclusionary to 20 to 30 members, and there's some like Don Wilson's firm that would like to become members of future clearinghouses.
Right. I mean, so to be clear again, you know, our view of the world as things become more cleared is not necessarily that we want to self-clear. Certainly, if we were, you know, if we wanted to self-clear, we're fine participating with whatever, you know, whatever process is decided, including, you know, the possibility of taking parts of portfolios in the event of a failed auction. But you know, we think that the better model is actually to encourage the FCM model. And in that case, you know, we're happy to work with FCMs in that default process. And you know, I'm not exactly sure what a failed auction means. I mean, does that mean nobody bid on the portfolio?
I don't know, but some of the clearinghouses around the table have said that that's a possibility. So maybe, but
well, I mean, a failed auction would be one in which the clearinghouse wasn't able to dispose of the portfolio for a price that was commensurate with the initial margin it was holding from a defaulting member. In other words, it would have run out of initial margin if it had accepted the best offer that it got. But the real issue here, the underlying issue, is centered around the massive difference between handling a defaulter's portfolio on listed markets, where you've got access to a market that's deep, it's liquid, it's well established, as opposed to handling large portfolios of illiquid positions, where the clearinghouse is completely dependent upon a competitive auction process. But the purpose of the failed allocation, Chairman, actually is not really to use it. The purpose of that is that it's a massive weapon at our disposal, and the reason that we need that is because that forces the members that are handling the default to make sure the auction works. And it was actually really interesting in practice to see this happen with the Lehman Brothers portfolio, because while that was all going on over the first few days, most of the members of the service started to become really, really frightened, and you know, quite anxious. And there were some heated moments actually, because they couldn't see what we were doing. They couldn't see what the people that they had deployed towards us over a Chinese wall were doing in terms of hedging the portfolio. So they didn't know what the P&L was doing, and they knew what the markets were doing because they're in the markets. And so the probability of us exceeding the initial margin in their eyes was actually very, very high. And they became really, really scared about this. And I'm absolutely convinced that that dynamic was what caused us to have a very competitive auction. So the purpose of it is not to use it, it's to encourage appropriate behaviour. Now, we're having some fascinating discussions with some of the same firms around credit derivatives at the moment. I think Jeff's probably already passed this line, where because of the different nature of the credit derivative market, in terms of its concentration, and in particular in terms of concentration around certain, single names that only a few firms trade or make markets in, the general view of our members is that that forced allocation can't be part of our armoury because it just doesn't work. It just wouldn't be fair, and it's just hard to make that happen. So what is now being discussed is, but everyone accepts the fact that there needs to be some weapon. So what's been discussed now, and the banks seem to actually be really strongly in favour of this at the moment at least, is that we'll calculate what we need for a default fund. We do our normal initial margin calculations. We'll size our default fund appropriately for the credit default swap, offering it separately. And then on top of that, we'll stick a significant extra big lump in the default fund. In other words, that the members would have to put quite a lot more of their capital on the line and directly at risk. And it's that risk and that weapon that would create the behaviour that we otherwise get through the forced allocation. So, and I'm sorry for the long answer to the question, but it's a massively important piece of sort of behavioural sort of inducement that we really need. And you can get it one or two different ways. But if we don't have that, then we are very nervous at relying on an auction just running its course.
I interrupted Dan. He could answer the legal question. I was just trying to help you two talk to each other across this public meeting.
No, I mean, just a couple comments on that. I think that, a lot of these markets are actually extremely liquid. And that's one of the things that's said to justify this is that they're illiquid. But I think that, one of the markets that we're interested in is the vanilla interest rate swap market, which obviously LCH clears quite a lot of. And I think that everybody knows that's a very liquid market. A lot of the CDS markets are actually liquid too. There's certainly some illiquid components of that as well. But I think that, in these liquid markets, a traditional auction process should be very effective. And to the extent that the initial margin doesn't cover the price, there are other ways of dealing with that. A forced allocation isn't the only way.
Dan, do you have any comments on?
I have nothing to add to the discussion that's already occurred. To Bob.
It seems like we're trying to balance two things. On the one hand, it is appropriate, indeed necessary, that, and part of the core principles, that clearinghouses have appropriate participant eligibility requirements. On the other hand, we want to avoid barriers to entry, and it seems to me that part of the way to maybe square these, to the extent that there's conflict in this, is to make sure that we're looking at this with appropriate imagination to say, well, what are the alternative ways? And so to the extent that it's necessary to have forced allocation as a means of socializing, then you need to look and say, well, how can that be accomplished? Must it be at that particular clearing member? Can a clearing member, for instance, outsource that to perhaps another member under the supervision of the clearinghouse? Or, as you mentioned, there are other ways of accomplishing it besides forced allocation. And so I guess we're hoping to see that folks are attacking this imaginatively rather than saying, okay, either you have this capability or you don't qualify, go away.
Connie?
Yeah, I'm a bit away from running big organizations, but when I was working for one of the big investment banks, among other responsibilities, I had responsibility for futures. And futures clearance was an extraordinarily competitive business. And I would imagine that clearing of OTC derivatives is going to become extraordinarily competitive as well. Recently, Barclays took on $200 billion of derivative clearing for Monte dei Paschi in Italy. And I would have thought that the cost of being a client clearer, or clearing through a clearing member, should not be very onerous as competition sets in, and that one could make markets by being a client of a clearing member. I don't know the pricing right now, but I think it's got to merge down towards what you will pay above and beyond being a clearing member, you save by not having to have the capital at risk.
Yeah, we're actually not concerned about the pricing so much. It's the actual access. So, for instance, right now in LCH Swap Clear, LCH has worked on coming out with this new client model. But the way that the workflows work are defined. If we wanted to trade with a non-dealer and clear that, in other words, provide liquidity to a non-dealer and then clear that trade at SwapClear, my understanding is the way that it's structured right now is specifically to preclude that type of activity, which we think is, not in the best interest of the overall functioning of the market. I'll also highlight at the CME has a CDS product which hasn't really taken off, but we've been unable to come to a clearing arrangement with any of the dealer clearing members who are able to offer that product, and it's not a question of price.
Jeff.
You have another alternative for that clearing.
Yeah, we've also had a hard time figuring out a way to access that market through that alternative. But thank you, Jeff.
We can talk afterwards. There, $300 million worth has come in already.
I gather this is not so much a legal question, but the statute, I'm one commissioner, I think the statute does have a number of access provisions. One is that clearinghouses give non-discriminatory open access to trading platforms. One is that the trading platforms have impartial access, that's in the statute. But also you're raising the question of access through participant eligibility. And I think Bob Wasserman said it very well, that these participant eligibility rules should not become barriers to entry. And what Don Wilson, I guess, is highlighting is maybe right now, am I correct? Your sense is right now they are barriers to entry.
Yes, that's correct. At this time they are.
Lori.
If I may, I think certainly it is our view they are barriers to entry. I think we'll be very interested to see where the Commission goes with this and where other regulators go is kind of the gap or the potential gap between Bob's comment of encouraging the clearinghouses to think creatively or think imaginatively about approaches to this and whether the CFTC is going to put real teeth in the fair and open access criteria. Because I think having been at the hands of the clearinghouses for quite a while, we'd like to see the playing field set by the Commission and not just by the clearinghouses and their members.
Is your view, Lori, that the playing field's not level right now?
Yeah, yes. I think the barriers to entry do not track to the actual products, and there's much room for approaches that would open up the FCM clearing community, and that's what we're hearing from buy-side clients who want to have a different choice and access.
And we actually think that the ownership restrictions are not the way to solve this problem. We think that the ownership restrictions may actually prevent competition rather than solve this problem. We think it's more of a governance issue and a specific rulemaking issue.
Does anyone else have any questions or comments with regard to the rulemaking and Dodd-Frank, that legal questions that Dan may be able to answer? Jiro?
Yeah, I have more of a step back, broader question. So the EC proposals have some rules that could be used in your rulemaking process. Is there any thoughts on the approach? I mean, for example, the threshold, information threshold, clearing threshold could be used to define major swap participants. There's penalties for SDRs that are clearly defined in the proposal. Is there a general approach that the CFTC will take on taking that into consideration?
On all the rulemaking teams where there's been an international, where we've identified an international component or potentially international interest, Jackie's got a member on the team, and that is being factored into each of the rulemaking teams. What is the international approach? Is it a good idea? Where should we, consider harmonization? And there have been a number of standards, specifically in clearing has been, these where and things like this, where these been really factored in very heavily into the rulemaking team process. So yes.
And I would just note something that Chairman Ginzer said publicly last week. So I'm taking your words, but once the European Commission proposal came out, the rulemaking teams were given instruction from him to implement whatever we could take from the European Commission's proposal. So you couldn't get a stronger recommendation than that, and the rulemaking teams are trying to actively implement wherever we can and wherever it makes sense.
Richard?
Dan, I must admit, I think one of the takeaways from today's session is that if we look at the clearing process and we look at the trade repository process, the timing of the European, Japanese, and American processes are sufficiently on top of each other that we've had that opportunity to go back, check what the other guys bring to the table, and then bake that all into the process. And I think, as Patrick highlighted, the differences between the two in those areas, or the three, if we include the Japanese version as well, are relatively limited, and to all intents and purposes, I think where the differences are, they are capable of being ironed out, and there is a process to do so. The area that I think we've discussed very little today is the trading side. And that is where our timelines are out of sync, because the MiFID review isn't really going to get going until the American process is reasonably far advanced. I think it's going to be a lot harder to back up. Now, I appreciate this may be more a discussion of policy than a specific legal process, but I'm just interested as to what your view is on the process to ensure we don't get so far out of sync on the trading side, and in particular definitions of CEFs. And it's my view that there are higher risks of philosophical differences of opinion on the trading side than has been the case on clearing, not least where we had the statement from the G20, which made clearing one of, I would say, the less controversial areas compared to trading. But I'd just be interested in your view on how we stay in sync, given the Europeans are a little bit behind, or actually quite a long way behind, given the separation of the process from the...
I will just start out with the answer, and then I'm going to hand off to Jackie as to how we can integrate the two on a different timeline. But I would just emphasize that our timeline is statutorily mandated. CFTC, we have virtually no flexibility in the timeline for doing these rules. In order to meet the deadline for July 16th, 2011, 360 days after enactment, we're working diligently on the proposed rules right now. Had 3 come out last Friday. Will be coming out, hopefully it's the intent to have a number of others proposed in the upcoming weeks. But we are really have virtually no flexibility on the speed at which we're going. It's dictated to us by Congress. So within that time frame, how are we taking what Europe's doing? And I'll let Jackie answer that.
I think Patrick said it earlier that it's not a surprise that the European Commission's proposal ccame out largely in line with Dodd-Frank. And it wasn't because they just looked at it on paper once Dodd-Frank was out and then just picked it up and implemented it. There was a ton of conversations before even Dodd-Frank was passed with the European Commission, as there is on the trading bit of it. Patrick's team isn't handling it in the European Commission. On that side, it's Maria Valenza. But we've had regular calls with Maria Valenza and her staff and our staff here working on the trading requirement. To actually take on ideas that they're thinking about and to share with them where we're going. So you're right that this issue is highly controversial even in Europe, and Peter can talk about that. It's a hotly debated issue, but we're taking ideas from them and they're taking ideas from us, and I think we're going to see some of the similar results that we saw in the trading and clearing part of it.
Any other comments before we move to the Foreign Board of Trade issue? If not, we'll move to two of our CFTC staff from the Division of Market Oversight, Dwayne Andreessen and David Van Wagner, to present to us on the Foreign Board of Trade issues that are within the Dodd-Frank and the rulemaking that we'll have to do on this issue.
Good afternoon. This is just by way of introduction to Dwayne getting control of the PowerPoint. Dodd-Frank authorized the Commission to establish a new market category, registered foreign boards of trade. While the registered foreign board of trade category is the rulemaking to establish rules around the process and standards for registered foreign boards of trade was discretionary and not mandatory, the Commission has decided to go ahead with a rulemaking because we thought it was important to bring more transparency to the process and the standards by which foreign boards of trade come and get access to U.S.-based traders, and to replace the current process that we use, which is a staff-driven no-action process, which has been in place for 14 years or so. So by way of ticking through the Dodd-Frank provisions and some of the issues that we're thinking about in the context of the rulemaking, Dwayne will take you through that.
Thanks, David. Good afternoon. Hit the wrong button. There's the famous disclaimer. And this slide looks a lot like the one that was just up there for a few minutes during the last discussion. The Dodd-Frank bill provides that the Commission may require registration for foreign boards of trade that want to permit identified members and other participants in the United States with direct access to their trading system. It also says the CFTC can adopt rules and regulations prescribing the procedures and requirements applicable to that registration. That's the duty of the current rulemaking team. The registration requirement, as David mentioned, will replace the current practice of issuing staff no-action letters. Currently, we have 20 active letters, 20 exchanges that have active no-action letters, of whom 14 are showing volume from within the United States. In adopting these rules and regulations, the Commission shall consider whether the Foreign Board of Trade is subject to comparable, comprehensive supervision and regulation by the appropriate governmental authorities in the FBOT's home country. I understand from earlier today that was all whittled down to whether the FBOT is subject to equivalent regulation in its home country. Some other things that would be looked at during the context of a registration requirement are these 7 areas. Probably, because we're not really certain at this point, but these are the 7 areas that form the basis of the review for the no-action process. Particularly the trading system, does it comply with the IOSCO principles, settlement and clearing, same kinds of things that the Commission would look at as part of a DCM registration. The Dodd-Frank bill also has special provisions for linked contracts. That is, the Commission cannot permit a foreign board of trade to provide direct access to its trading system unless the Commission determines that the foreign board of trade does the following with respect to any linked contract. That is, a contract that settles against any price of a contract listed on a U.S. registered entity. The Foreign Board of Trade must make available daily trading information that's equivalent to that of the linked contract. It must establish equivalent position limits. It must have it or its regulatory authority must have the capability to require position adjustments. It must provide information to the Commission, large trader information that is comparable to that provided for the linked contract, and it must provide the Commission information for the aggregate trader positions. Those are basically the provisions in the Dodd-Frank Act. Some of the considerations that would impact a rulemaking with respect to registration for a foreign board of trade are on the next 3 slides. That is, as we said, the registration requirement replaces the current practice of no action letters. To what extent should the registration submission requirements match those, the requirements of the no action letters? And should registration be viewed as a codification of the current no action policy or something different? Secondly, what standard should the Commission use to determine if a foreign board of trade should be eligible for registration? The 4 standards that are listed here are those that were published in the Commission's policy statement in 2006, in which the Commission endorsed the no action policy. Another set of provisions that are considered would be considered in any rulemaking. What should constitute comparable comprehensive supervision and regulation by appropriate government authorities in the Foreign Board of Trade's home country? To what extent does that mean that the Foreign Board of Trade is subject to comprehensive supervision and regulation that is comparable to that the CFTC provides in overseeing its DCMs? Secondly, how should the registration requirements affect foreign boards of trade that currently have no action relief? Should the 20 foreign boards of trade be grandfathered and not have to apply for registration at all? Should there be some kind of limited registration based on the fact that they've already been reviewed once and determined to be adequate for the no action process? Or should they be treated like a brand new applicant? And finally, in terms of the consideration, the Dodd-Frank bill defines direct access for purposes of Foreign Board of Trade registration to refer to an explicit grant of authority by a Foreign Board of Trade to an identified member or other participant located in the U.S. to enter trades directly into the trade matching system of the Foreign Board of Trade. Now, we are well aware that there are many different methodologies for electronic transmission of orders that are not exactly like this, but are very similar to this. For instance, if a 3010 firm allows orders to be routed to it and they simply pass through the risk management filter without any additional interface with the infrastructure, is that not direct access? And what about a firm that authorizes its clients to connect directly to the Foreign Board of Trade under the firm's mnemonic or password, referred to by IOSCO as sponsored access? To what extent are those kinds of access to a trade matching engine equivalent to direct access, such that the Commission should consider requiring those foreign boards of trade to register? The proposed registration rules will be published in the Federal Register before the end of the year. We would certainly welcome your comments on any area of the proposed rule. And the rulemaking is on a 1-year time frame. Even though it's discretionary, it's on a 360-day time frame. And if you wish to make comments, there is a way to make comments, including the FBOT registration team page, if you wish to make comments before any proposed rule hits the street. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dwayne. Richard?
Dwayne, thank you. I think, as Chairman Gensler has said, the process of the no action letters is something that grew up over the years. I'm sure we wouldn't have introduced it if we'd known it had grown into something that it is today. I think my main concern is that to have a process that is one way, i.e. a process where a foreign board of trade wanting to grant access to US participants goes under this process, is going to lead inevitably to a whole load of bilateral arrangements that exist around the world. So whether it's ICE or any of the entities that exist in the US that want to provide access to other countries, I think it would be great if we could come, whether it's using IOSCO or otherwise, to a process where we could come up with a global standard. And I think undoubtedly these are going to incorporate a load of best practices to do just that. But much as I think the Part 30 process, which had so much of this mutual recognition, sharing of information, whether we could come up with something similar, I think it would be a tremendous step forward of efficiency in trying to achieve the new, what will be a better and more regulated process. But I would strongly endorse the idea that we try to use IOSCO to come up with a multilateral process rather than everybody putting their own access rights in place.
Tom?
My question is really, how do we ensure that as the Commission moves forward with this discretionary rule writing, that there are not unintended consequences, just to take some of Richard's comments a bit further, that actually create trade barriers? Life has been subject to this no action regime since 1998, and our experience is that it's worked exceptionally well. Although informal, it's a very robust process. It was further strengthened in 2008 to give further requirements around foreign contracts linked to U.S. markets. Certainly requires a high level of coordination between international regulators, but certainly from everything we've heard today, that's happening. So our concern, given that 1/3 of the volume on our European Life Exchange comes from U.S. clients, which is a direct result, I think, of the success of the current no-action regime, that if this causes foreign jurisdictions to retaliate and force their own registrations, although it may be helpful, as Richard said, if there are some standards, but there'll be no requirement that those are followed. There could be very severe unintended consequences. So, we have a process right now that I think has been exceptionally effective. It sounds from the proposal that we're formalizing processes in many instances that are happening right now anyways. How do we guard against those unintended consequences that could really hurt global flows of capital?
If you look around the globe at other countries' mutual recognition regimes, they actually have a registration process in place. It's sort of what we're contemplating at the CFTC. And actually, I think the process that this is embedded in a statute should give the foreign exchanges more comfort, because a staff no action today could just be ripped out by staff at any time. So this is a formal in statute recognition process which will grant access to U.S. customers. I think you're right. You rightly point out that we're codifying sort of what's there now on an informal basis. There will, of course, be some adjustments to keep in line with sort of raising the bar, but we hope those won't be out of sync with what other regulators are doing around the globe.
Tom, I mean, and Jeff might want to comment on this, but one of the things that I found is, and it was right even in my confirmation process, this whole concept that a regulatory body, the CFTC, over some, 14 years is it, has done 20 of these at the staff level. They weren't necessarily at the full commission level, even though sometimes they went through what was called a absent objection process. But that sort of lacks some credibility to certain members of Congress and the public. And so here's a very transparent process. The public will be able to comment on the set of proposed rules. I'm sure we'll adjust them in some way before we get to the final rules, because that's the process. So I'm encouraged by this. I think it brings greater transparency and public input and hopefully uniformity to it. But again, I sense what you're saying is you're a little nervous because something's worked. And so what you know has worked, and you're worried for New York Stock Exchange Life as to what might come.
Having oh, there we go, great. No, I think that's exactly right. And in that we are formalizing a process that's been in place for 14 years. It's tried, true, it has worked.
I would say it hasn't fully worked. It hasn't gained the full confidence and credibility of the public.
That's a perception issue, which may be valid, but the technical details of how this process worked before and after are going to be largely unchanged, at least from what I understand from the proposal. So I'm just worried again about the unintended consequences. If the facts aren't changing, we're just formalizing this through this formal registration process. How do we guard against this becoming a trade barrier? And I think that's a hard question to answer. We're not going to know until the rule goes into effect.
Mike?
If I may enter in here with just a couple of thoughts. First of all, Tom, I understand your concerns, but in my opinion, this gives much greater legal certainty as to what is taking place because it is codified now. And we have had recently situations where a chairman or a division director has said, well, I'm going to change that no action letter. And just like that, with no rhyme or reason, under our regulations, they don't have to tell you why they're going to be changing that. They can just yank it. And I feel this gives a great deal more certainty. The second aspect is uniformity. And as during my tenure, as I see things evolving here on these no action letters, that initially there were a couple of points that said, all right, we have to have these in there. Later on, 3 or 4 more points were added. Now we're up to 7 points that need to be added. All of those originally were in there, and the no action letter only applies to those that had that no action letter to them, and not uniformly across the entire industry. So, in my opinion, this really does give an opportunity for everybody to be on a level playing field.
I guess I would say that I agree with codifying and formalizing the process, but in doing so, to take into consideration some of the concerns of the people that have been operating under the no action process, and a process that has not had problems besides the linked contract issues that we've dealt with separately. I do have a question for Jackie. If there is an IOSCO work stream on mutual recognition?
Well, there was, and maybe Dwayne knows the date, of the screen-based project in IOSCO, which came up with a mutual recognition regime for foreign boards of trade. It's something that we actually at the CFTC used as a basis for our no action process. So, and it's what other countries modeled their regimes of mutual recognition on. It's been quite some time since we've looked at that. So maybe what I'm hearing is it's time to kind of take another look at it in IOSCO. But there is something that tried to harmonize this process really early on.
Great, thank you. Bonnie?
Dwayne, you mentioned that there was some talk about what direct access from the U.S. means, and you talked about sponsored access and access through firm-provided filters. Is there any thought that this new provision is going to change the way you thought about what presence in the U.S. means under the no action letters versus under this statutory and regulatory regime?
It's hard to say now, but I wouldn't guess. I wouldn't think so.
You wouldn't think that it would change?
No. Okay. I mean, the idea that the direct access is from the United States is in the definition. It's just what is encompassed within that definition in the real world in terms of order routing systems. But there would still be players from within the United States that would be impacted.
Having been around for the first time we talked about this stuff, it was a very big issue, because obviously when FCMs provide access through their own trading systems, that doesn't necessarily make the exchange present in the United States. And this is another place where there's some room for mischief, because if you overly broadly define what presence in a country means through, in an electronic world, what in the world does that mean anyway? You worry about having too many people cross-registering across. So I just think it's something we have to be conscious of. And obviously the no-action regime has worked well in this regard. So it's a place where we would vote thumbs up for those interpretations.
Just to add, Congress actually had some decent wordage on this. I mean, there's wording in there about the exchange itself being the actor, which gives explicit authority, and which is helpful. But as with all things, I think in Dodd-Frank, we are concerned about the possibility of evasion, where an exchange might encourage direct access, and because they don't want to bother to be coming to us. So I think it's fair to say on this issue, there will be a number of questions, regardless of how the Commission proposes the rule. So I would definitely watch the Federal Register space.
Anthony.
Yeah, I actually think that the shift from no action is entirely right. I think it's an unacceptable concept in the post-crisis climate to say that it's actually no action. It sounds rather negative. So I think the idea of going to an overseas licensing regime, which is where most of the jurisdictions are moving towards, is entirely right. I think the risk is, and I think Bonnie touched on it, is will this be a vehicle for redefining what is a US exchange? And I think there is a certain nervousness because, as you know, we had this debate 3 or 4 years ago. I think it was a debate. Was it longer? I'm getting older. I feel my memory's no good anymore. And the other thing is actually whether or not there are going to be additional rules that, if you like, are brought under this new title of describing the way in which exchanges can do business in the US. So I think those are the worry areas. But my understanding is that there isn't going to be a raft of new rules sitting under this, and that it's actually going to be more of the way of describing it as a positive regime for the purposes of the Hill particularly, rather than a negative regime.
Poor Dwayne is trying to answer the questions. He doesn't really know. There are 5 independently Senate-confirmed commissioners who will, so I just want to get Dwayne off the hook for a little bit and say, as David Van Wagner said, you'll have to wait for the Federal Register release. We have a lot to debate and discuss. And I note that because the old Foreign Board of Trade no action regime was about futures. And now we have this product called swaps. And so one of the things I've at least been briefed on is how does this relate to swaps? And so there may be, it may not go to Bonnie's question, but I just wouldn't put Dwayne in the box of saying, well, nothing's going to change, because I just think that would be unfair to do to Dwayne. And we have the whole world of swaps in here too.
I would certainly encourage you to comment. Your comments will be taken into account, believe me. There are some areas that we're really interested in how the industry feels about it, how our approach should go, and I promise you, we will consider all comments.
If there are no other comments on specifically Foreign Board of Trade issues, I think I'll ask if any of the members have any general comments, and we can wrap up the meeting unbelievably early today. And do any of my fellow commissioners have any closing comments? I just want to say thank you again to not only the CFTC staff that put together the presentations that are on the agenda today, but to all of you for being here, and especially to Peter and Patrick for being here, and for Mr. Sumi and Mr. Mori from Japanese FSA. Thank you so much for traveling. I'm sure it's been a very long day for you, and we appreciate you sitting through this almost 4-hour meeting to talk about these very important issues. Do you have any closing comments?
I was just going to thank Jill for her leadership of this. These international issues are so important to us, all 5 of the commissioners. Also thanking them for their work, and the full panel for the discussion. I'm glad to see that Roger and Don got closer to this participant membership thing, but it seems like there's a little bit more work to be done there.
I'd like to thank all of the participants and all our presenters. And Ms. Chairman, I thought you were very artful in getting that exchange of ideas there. And I wish everyone a pleasant movie on their flight home.
Thank you to everyone, and especially to my staff, Mike Otten, who's our new designated federal official for the Global Markets Advisory Committee, and Marcia Blaze, and my assistant Sharon Floyd, who put together all the specific details for this. If you have any further questions with regard to this meeting, don't hesitate to call my office. Thank you.